somewhere in the quiet corners of medieval Europe, perhaps along the winding paths of the English countryside, or the shadowed hills of what we now call France, a night in 1110 began without any hint of the extraordinary. People had finished their labours by the light of oil lamps and hearth fires, the kind that cast long, steady shadows across wooden tables and earthen floors. The air carried the familiar scents of wood smoke and damp earth. The sky overhead held the usual scatter of stars, clear enough on this particular evening to guide a traveller or comfort a sleepless child. It was the sort of night when the world felt settled into its rhythms, the moon expected to rise full and silver, tracing its slow arc as it had through countless seasons before. Yet, as the hours passed toward midnight, something shifted in the heavens with a quiet persistence that no one could immediately name. The moon climbed into view, as anticipated, round and luminous against the dark. Its surface etched with the faint patterns familiar to those who watch the skies from fields or monastery walls. Then, gradually, a veil seemed to draw across it, not the familiar reddish glow of a shadowed lunar face, but a deeper fading, though the light itself were being drawn away into some unseen depth. Witnesses in scattered hamlets and along lonely roads noticed the change, first as a dimming, then as an absence, for the moon slipping from sight entirely, until the sky held only stars and an unsettling emptiness where its presence had been. No reappearance followed in the expected time, no gradual return of reflected light to reassure those gazing upward. The darkness lingered, turning an ordinary evening into something that felt suspended between the known world and whatever lay beyond it. In those first moments, confusion spread like ripples across still water. A farmer stepping outside to check his animals might have paused, rubbing his eyes as if the fault lay in his vision rather than the sky. A group of travellers resting by a roadside fire would have fallen silent, their conversation drifting into questions murmured low, each one testing whether others saw the same void. Monks in their cloisters, accustomed to marking the hours by celestial signs, found their routines interrupted by this unexpected blankness, the night stretching longer than any chronicle had prepared them to expect. Terror did not erupt all at once but built in layers, fed by the absence of explanation, and the weight of living in an age where the heavens were read as messages from powers far greater than human understanding. Some reached for lanterns or torches, as though earthly light could fill the gap left above, while others simply stood rooted, watching the empty arc where the moon had been, their breaths visible in the chill air. Fosts. This vanishing carried with it a mystery that would echo through the months and years ahead, raising questions about what forces could steal something as constant as the moon, and whether its turn was ever truly certain. Could the same sky that had guided generations suddenly withhold its light without reason? Or did this moment point to deeper shifts in the world below? Changes in weather patterns or distant rumblings in the earth that people of the time had no instruments to measure. The accounts that survive hint at a lingering unease, sense that the night had revealed a fragility in the order of things. Yet they leave room for us to wonder how much was observed directly, and how much grew in the retelling around winter fires. As the story of that evening unfolds further, it invites us to consider the fragile boundary between the familiar and the unknown, the way a single night could plant seeds of doubt that would shape interpretations for generations. What if the moon's disappearance was not an isolated event, but the beginning of a longer silence in the heavens, one that aligned with other strange occurrences whispered about in distant lands? Such possibilities linger without demanding firm answers, allowing the mind to drift through the quiet spaces between recorded fact and the human need to find meaning in the dark. Before we continue into the deeper layers of this history, I wonder if you might take a moment to share in the comments where you are listening from and what time it happens to be there. Hearing from listeners across different places and hours helps weave a thread of connection through these nighttime reflections, reminding us that stories like this one travel far beyond their origins. The central puzzle of 1110 rests in that prolonged absence, not merely the eclipse itself, but the way it seemed to stretch the ordinary passage of nights into something uncertain. Medieval eyes, trained to notice portents in comets or unusual alignments, encountered here a void that offered no immediate omen to interpret, only the raw fact of missing light. This left space for imagination to fill the gap. Yet it also preserved a record of raw bewilderment that feels remarkably close across the centuries. Host. One can picture a child asking why the moon had gone, and receiving no answer that satisfied, or an elder recalling similar nights from youth, only to find this one unmatched in its completeness. The terror remained personal and immediate, tightening in the chest, as the stars alone held the sky, their cold points offering little warmth against the sense that something essential had slipped away. Through this lens, the night becomes a doorway into the broader questions that the coming sections will explore, questions about how people of that era understood the movements above them, and what happened when those movements defied expectation. The mystery endures not because it was solved in a single moment, but because it persisted, inviting later observers to revisit the same sky with fresh eyes and lingering curiosity. In the calm of your own evening, this account may stir a gentle awareness of how thin the line can be between routine and revelation, how a single vanishing can ripple outward long after the light returns. In the quiet monasteries and scattered villages of that time, the movements of the heavens were watched. With a mixture of reverence and careful study, tools available differed greatly from later centuries. Medieval people had inherited fragments of older knowledge about lunar eclipses, drawn from Roman writers and earlier Greek traditions, preserved in monastic libraries. They understood that the moon could pass through the Earth's shadow, dimming its light in a way that followed certain rhythms tied to the lunar cycle. Yet this awareness remained partial, shaped by observation rather than precise prediction, and often blended with the sense that such events carried meanings beyond mere mechanics. Monk, copying manuscripts, might note patterns in the moon's phases over years of careful watching, recognizing that eclipses tend to occur near full moons at predictable intervals. Yet he would have no instruments to measure distances or calculate exact timings with certainty. This left room for the unexpected to intrude, did on that night, in 1110, when the usual signs pointed toward a familiar event. But the outcome stretched far beyond what records or memory had prepared anyone to expect. Eclipses held a place in medieval understanding as phenomena that could, in principle, be anticipated through accumulated notes and rough tables passed down in religious houses. Travellers or shepherds might recall tales of previous darkenings, where the moon took on a coppery tint before returning to brightness. And these stories reinforce the idea that the sky followed an ordered path. The predictability stemmed from the steady dance of sun, earth, and moon as it was then conceived, allowing some anticipation of when shadows might fall. Still, this one defied those expectations in its depth and duration, slipping into complete absence rather than the partial veiling that chronicles sometimes described. One can imagine the quiet surprise in a scriptorium when the event refused to align with prior accounts, prompting whispers about whether the calculations had missed some subtle shift, or whether the heavens themselves had altered their course. Such moments invited gentle reflection rather than firm conclusions, as observers weighed the possibility that their knowledge captured only a portion of the celestial order. At the heart of this worldview lay the geocentric model, in which the Earth rested motionless at the centre of all things, with the moon, sun, and stars circling around it in nested spheres. This arrangement, drawn from ancient authorities and adapted through medieval scholarship, placed the moon as the closest heavenly body, its light borrowed from the sun, and its path crossing the Earth's shadow at regular points. In the 12th century, this picture offered comfort through its symmetry, suggesting a harmonious system where each element had its appointed place. Scholars in cathedral schools or isolated abbeys might sketch these circles in the margins of texts, pondering how the moon's orbit allowed for occasional alignments without disrupting the larger dance. Yet the model also carried an implicit assumption of regularity, one that made prolonged vanishings feel like interruptions in the divine architecture. The Earth-centered view did not demand absolute precision in every detail, leaving space for variations that observers could attribute to unknown influences or the limits of human sight. The Church played a central role in these celestial observations, as monasteries served as centres for tracking time and maintaining calendars, essential to religious life. Monks rose at appointed hours, guided by the stars and moon. Their vigils intertwined with the rhythms of the night sky, while calculation for movable feasts like Easter relied on lunar cycles preserved in computers' tables. This relationship blended practical need with spiritual significance, as the heavens were seen as expressions of order created by a higher power, their movements worthy of study to better honour that creation. Clergy might record unusual sights in annals not as challenges to faith, but as prompts for contemplation, copying older works on astronomy alongside theological treatises. In this setting, the sky became a shared text, collectively through generations, read collectively through generations, though interpretations remained open to the possibility of deeper layers beyond immediate sight. The connection fostered careful watching rather than dismissal, encouraging the preservation of sightings that might otherwise have faded from memory. Eclipse. An eclipse that refused to follow expected patterns therefore stirred a particular unease because it touched the foundations of how the world was understood to hold together. If the moon could vanish so completely and linger without return, it raised quiet questions about whether the geocentric harmony was as steady as assumed, or whether unseen forces could intervene in ways that records had not captured. This sense of disruption did not require widespread panic to take root. It could settle in the thoughts of a single observer, noting the empty sky from a cloister garden, wondering how such an event fit into the larger sequence of seasons and signs. Possibilities emerged in the space between observation and explanation, suggesting that the event might point to shifts in weather, or distant natural changes, rather than solely to celestial mechanics. The troubling aspect lay in this openness, where the absence of light invited the mind to wander through some uncertainties that felt both personal and universal, echoing long after the moon reappeared. As these reflections settle into the evening, they open pathways toward the scientific details that followed in later accounts, where the same sky continued to invite inquiry without demanding immediate resolution. In the hush of that same night, one might picture the earth turning slowly beneath a canopy of stars, its bulk casting a long shadow across the path of the moon as it reached fullness. The cause lay in a simple alignment, the sun, earth, and moon falling into a straight line, so that the planet's silhouette swept over the lunar surface, dimming its borrowed light without ever touching it directly. This passage through shadow unfolds in stages, first a gentle bite at the edge, then a deeper obscuring that medieval observers had sometimes watched, turn the moon a muted copper or dusky red, as sunlight bent through the layers of air surrounding the earth, and reached the shadowed side. Yet on this occasion the usual glow failed to appear, leaving instead an emptiness that felt more complete, as though the familiar rhythms had paused without warning or explanation. Atmospheric conditions that year carried their own uncertainties, with reports from scattered chroniclers hinting at a sky that held more than ordinary haze. Dust or finer particles suspended high above the surface could have altered how light travelled, scattering shorter wavelengths while absorbing others in ways that prevented the reddish tint from forming at all. One possibility centres on distant volcanic activity, eruptions that might have lofted ash into the stratosphere, where it lingered for months, creating a veil that thickened the Earth's shadow beyond its normal reach. Such events, though not recorded in every corner of the known world, appear in fragments from other regions around the same period, suggesting a broader cooling or dimming that could have influenced the eclipse without anyone at the time connecting the threads directly. Theories about these climate factors remain open to gentle speculation, for the records offer glimpses rather than proof. Volcanic dust might explain the deeper vanishing by blocking refracted sunlight more thoroughly clear air would allow, turning what should have been a coppery disk into something closer to absence. Other influences, such as seasonal moisture, or even traces of smoke from widespread fires, could have played supporting roles, each adding a layer of variability that made the outcome less predictable than the orbital mechanics alone would suggest. In this light, the event invites curiosity about how small shifts in the air above could transform a familiar celestial passage into something that felt entirely new, without requiring any single cause to stand as certain. Interpretations of why the moon seemed to disappear rather than redden, therefore, branch in several directions, each resting on the same underlying alignment, yet coloured by different conditions overhead. Some accounts from later centuries describe similar darkenings during periods of heavy atmospheric loading, where the usual bending of light was interrupted, enough to leave only a faint outline, or none at all. Here the possibility arises that the shadow itself grew unusually dense, or the moon's surface reflected less of the filtered rays because of the intervening veil. Nothing in the surviving notes claims a definitive link. Yet, The pattern of prolonged dimness encourages reflection on how the same geometry might produce varying results depending on the state of the air through which the light must travel. As these possibilities unfold, they connect back to the quiet surprise felt by those who watched from cloister gardens or open fields, where the absence lingered longer than memory prepared them to expect. The science of the alignment offers a frame, steady and measurable in its cycles, while the atmospheric elements add a layer of chance that keeps the full picture gently unresolved. One can imagine the same hillside in central Italy under a sky, the olive trees still holding their ancient shapes, while the heavens continue their measured dance, now understood through additional lenses, are yet still carrying room for wonder at the unexpected turns. Such thoughts drift onward toward the wider world of that era, where daily life unfolded beneath skies that held both order and surprise in equal measure. In the quiet expanse of those same years, one might picture the lands of Europe stretching beneath skies that offered both reassurance and sudden mystery, where the rhythms of suns and fat season guided the planting of fields and the gathering of harvests in a world still shaped by ancient forests and winding rivers. Early in the 12th century, the continent presented a patchwork of realms held together by fragile alliances and the weight of custom, with villages clustered around wooden halls or stone keeps that rose against the horizon like silent guardians of uncertain peace. Rolling hills gave way to dense woodlands, where wolves and deer moved unseen, while along the coasts and river valleys, small markets stirred with the exchange of wool, grain, and iron tools, forged in the heat of charcoal fires, all under a light that could shift without warning from clear brilliance to veiled dimness. Political currents flowed through this landscape in patterns of ambition and inheritance, where the echoes of earlier conquests still shaped daily existence. In the wake of the Norman arrival in England some decades before, tensions lingered between those who held power through sword and those who traced their claims to older lines, creating a realm where loyalty shifted with the seasons and the ambitions of lords, who built motte and bailey fortifications to secure their holdings. Across the Channel, the French crown navigated its own delicate balance, with the Capetian seeking to extend influence over fractious nobles whose castles dotted the countryside. Further east, the Holy Roman domains encompassed a vast and varied collection of duchies and bishoprics bound grooved by oaths that often frayed under the strain of succession disputes. One can imagine how such divisions might have coloured the way communities responded to unexpected celestial events, for a sky that withheld its usual light could stir thoughts of favour, withdrawn or order, unsettled in realms already marked by shifting borders and contested thrones. Key figures moved through these territories with varying degrees of authority, their decisions rippling outward to touch the lives of peasants and scholars alike. In England, the reign of Henry I brought efforts to consolidate rule through careful administration and strategic marriages, yet the memory of earlier upheavals remained fresh enough to remind subjects that stability was never assured. In France, Pope Louis VI worked to strengthen royal presence amid challenges from regional powers, while in the German lands, Henry V navigated relations with powerful ecclesiastical princes whose support could bolster or undermine imperial claims. Beyond these western centres, the Byzantine court in the east maintained its own intricate web of diplomacy and ceremony, Fran Fimead. Its influence reaching into Mediterranean ports, where traders carried tales of distant customs. Such rulers presided over societies where personal allegiance often outweighed abstract notions of state, allowing for the possibility that an eclipse observed from a distant hillside might be interpreted through the lens of local grievances or hopes for divine favour toward one lord or another. At the heart of daily existence stood the church, presence woven into every aspect of life, from the ringing of bells that marked the hours of prayer to the stone churches that served as gathering places for baptism, marriage, and burial. Monasteries and cathedrals rose in many regions as centres of both spiritual guidance and practical knowledge, where monks tended gardens, recorded the passage of years in careful annals past, and offered shelter to travellers seeking respite from the road. The influence of bishops and abbots extended into political matters as well, for the church held lands and revenues that made it a participant in the same contests for power that occupied secular lords. Yet its teachings also provided a framework of meaning that could encompass both the predictable cycles of the heavens and those rarer moments when familiar order seemed to falter. In villages and towns, priests interpreted scripture and saints' lives for congregations, whose understanding of the wider world often rested on oral accounts, passed across generations, creating a climate where faith offered comfort amid uncertainties that included not only crop failures or raids, but also the occasional darkening of the moon. Intellectual and cultural currents moved slowly through this setting, carried in manuscripts, copied by hand, and in conversations held within cloister walls or around evening fires. Learning remained largely the province of those within religious orders. The study of Latin texts preserved fragments of earlier Roman and Greek thought. Alongside biblical commentary, the full recovery of classical works still lay in the future, and new ideas arrived only gradually through contacts with scholars in Spain or Sicily. Astronomy, for instance, drew on inherited models that placed the Earth at the centre of circling spheres, yet observations of actual skies depended on the clarity of nights and the patience of those who watched for portents, without instruments beyond the naked eye. Cultural expression found voice in vernacular songs and stories that blended heroic legends with moral lessons, while the growing number of pilgrimage routes encouraged exchanges of customs and relics that enriched local traditions without erasing regional differences. One might reflect on how such a climate, marked by reverence for established authority alongside room for wonder at unexplained phenomena, could allow an event like the moon's unusual dimming to linger in memory as both a sign to be pondered and a reminder of the limits of human foresight. The rhythms of agriculture and trade continued beneath these layers of governance and belief, peasants labouring in open fields under systems of obligation that tied them to manners whose lords in turn answered to higher powers. Prude, in regions where Roman roads still traced faint lines across the land, goods moved by cart or barge toward fairs that brought together distant strangers for brief seasons of barter and news. Towns began to stir with modest growth in some areas, their walls enclosing workshops where smiths and weavers pursued crafts passed down through families. Yet the overarching sense remained one of interdependence with the natural world, where a prolonged haze or an altered eclipse might prompt quiet speculation about harvests to come or the favour of unseen forces. Such conditions invited gentle curiosity about how communities adapted to variability, preserving stories of past anomalies, while continuing the essential work of sowing and reaping that sustained the entire structure. As these elements interwove across Europe, the possibility arises that the intellectual atmosphere encouraged a blend of acceptance and inquiry, where monastic chroniclers noted unusual occurrences not as disruptions to be feared alone, but as entries in the long record of divine creation. Climate similarly allowed for interpretations that drew on both scripture and local law, creating space for narrative that could comfort or caution, without claiming exhaustive explanation. The world of 1110 emerges as one where the familiar and the unexpected coexisted, the steady turning of seasons providing continuity even as political shifts and celestial surprises reminded inhabitants that their place within the larger order remained open to contemplation rather than fixed certainty. Thoughts of these lands, with their castles and cloisters, their rulers and their faithful, drift onward from the hillside vantage, suggesting how the same skies that witnessed the eclipse also sheltered a human tapestry of resilience and quiet wonder. In the quiet hours when the moon's familiar glow withdrew from the heavens above those same European valleys and hillsides, people who lived beneath them encountered a moment of suspension that reached into every corner of daily life, stirring responses as varied as the landscapes themselves. One might picture villagers in the central Italian countryside pausing amid their evening teas, lanterns flickering in doorways as faces turned upward in shared silence, some drawing closer to one another for reassurance while others retreated indoors, their minds turning over possibilities that blended the ordinary concerns of harvest and hearth with deeper questions about the order they had always trusted. In such scattered hamlets, where news travelled at the pace of footsteps along winding paths, vanishing light could prompt immediate gatherings around fires, or in modest chapels, voices low with a mixture of apprehension and the instinctive search for meaning that had long guided communities through seasons of plenty and want alike. Further north, in the wooded regions of what would later be remembered as the borders between realms, monastic houses offered a different setting for these reactions, where the measured routines of prayer and labour met the unexpected dimming with a blend of reverence and quiet inquiry. Monks accustomed to noting the passage of stars in their annals might have stepped into cloister gardens or climbed to vantage points on tower roofs, their observations tempered by the discipline of recording rather than alarm, though even here the human thread of uncertainty could suffice in murmured conversations or additional vigils that stretched into the night. The range of responses extended from those who felt a profound awe at the vastness unfolding above them, sensing a reminder of forces beyond human reach, to others whose thoughts edged toward unease, interpreting the absence as a signal that familiar protections had momentarily thinned. Such diversity arose naturally in a world where personal faith intertwined with inherited law, allowing individuals to navigate the same celestial shift through lenses shaped by their own experiences of loss, hope, or simple endurance. Contemporary accounts from the period, preserved in the careful script of chroniclers who witnessed or heard reports of the event, capture this spectrum, without exaggeration, noting how some communities responded with dead prayers that echoed through wooden churches and stone halls alike, while others found themselves drawn into moments of hushed contemplation that lingered long after the light returned. Puss. These records suggest that the reactions often unfolded in layers, beginning with the first observers who noticed the moon's unusual pallor, and spreading outward as word passed from one settlement to the next, carried by travellers on pilgrimage routes or merchants whose carts moved slowly between markets. In this way, the news of the darkened sky could reach distant corners of the continent over days or weeks, each retelling coloured by local circumstances. Whether the fertile plains of Francia or the rugged coasts where fishing communities looked to the same heavens for guidance on voyages yet to come, the human dimension of this cosmic uncertainty revealed itself most clearly in the intimate spaces, homes and gatherings, where families might have comforted one another with stories, passed down through generations, tales of earlier anomalies that had tested, but not overturned, the rhythms of existence. Children, perhaps, asked questions that adults answered with a gentle mix of reassurance and admission that some things remained beyond full understanding, fostering a sense of shared resilience rather than outright despair. In noble courts, where alliances hung on fragile threads, the event could invite private discussions among advisors and lords, their responses ranging from strategic calculations about how such signs might influence subjects' loyalties, to personal reflections on the limits of earthly power when confronted with the heavens' unpredictability. Across these varied settings, the absence of the moon did not halt the essential work of living, but instead wove itself into it, prompting small adjustments like extended watches over livestock or extra offerings at shrines, all while the underlying current of curiosity about the wider order persisted. As accounts travelled along river valleys and through mountain passes, interpretations multiplied. Urfanate, with some communities expressing a quiet terror that manifested in avoidance of nighttime travel, or heightened attention to omens in the natural world around them, while others embraced a sense of awe that deepened their appreciation for the cycles they had previously taken for granted. This spread of news relied on the interconnected web of monasteries, fairs, kinship, ties that already bound medieval Europe together, allowing a single night's observation in one region to echo in conversations hundreds miles away, each softened or intensified by the teller's own temperament and the needs of their audience. One can reflect on how such transmission preserved the event not as a singular catastrophe, but as a thread in the larger tapestry of human response to the unknown, encouraging later generations to ponder similar uncertainty with a measure of calm inherited from those who had lived through the original moment. In the villages clustered near the edges of ancient forests, the reactions often took on a communal character, with elders recalling fragments of earlier lore about darkened skies and their meanings, blending these with the teachings heard in weekly gatherings to create narratives that offered both caution and continuity. The range here stretched from individuals who felt an immediate impulse to seek shelter or perform protective rituals drawn from local customs to those who stood in open fields, their eyes adjusting to the altered light as a form of unexpected wonder that invited thoughts of the divine hand behind all creation. Contemporary chronicles hint at these personal dimensions through brief entries that mention widespread concern without specifying panic in every case, suggesting instead a thoughtful engagement with the event that varied by region and circumstance, from the more isolated hamlets where isolation amplified in individual fears to bustling ports where diverse voices mingled in shared observation. The movement of news across medieval Europe unfolded gradually. Much like the seasonal migrations of people and goods, pilgrims returning from distant shrines, carrying descriptions that sparked new conversations upon their arrival, and letters exchanged between ecclesiastical centres, providing more formal accounts that could be read aloud to assembled groups. The process allowed the initial reactions to evolve, transforming raw encounters with the vanished moon into stories that balanced terror at the momentary loss of light with awe. At the restoration that followed, reinforcing a cultural habit of viewing such events as opportunities for reflection rather than endpoints. In this human landscape of cosmic uncertainty, the emphasis remained on endurance. Communities resumed their labours under returning skies, carrying forward a quiet awareness that the heavens could surprise yet also sustain, much as the rivers and fields had always done. Extending this pattern to the eastern reaches of the continent, where Byzantine influences met Western traditions along trade routes, one finds similar layers of response: scholars and clergy, perhaps noting the phenomenon in terms drawn from inherited astronomical traditions. Common folk experienced it through the immediacy of daily rhythms, disrupted only briefly by the need to light additional lamps or gather for reassurance. The spectrum from terror to awe appeared consistently, modulated by local conditions such as recent harvests or political tensions that might colour interpretations without dominating them, allowing the event to serve as a gentle reminder of interconnectedness across distances. As these accounts continued their slow circulation, they contributed to a broader sense of shared humanity, where the uncertainty of one night became part of the enduring story of adaptation and quiet contemplation that defined the era. Through all these scenes, the core remained the individual and collective navigation of doubt, where each response, whether voiced in prayer or held in silent wonder, added to the resilience that allowed societies to move forward under skies that, occasionally altered, continued to mark the passage of time with their familiar return. This unfolding of reactions, documented in the annals of the period, and imagined through the lives they touched, underscores the profound yet understated ways in which a single celestial shift could illuminate the depths of human experience without overturning its foundations. In the quiet hours when those same European valleys and hillsides absorbed the news of the moon's retreat, the interpretations that took shape often turned toward the sacred teachings that framed daily existence for so many, offering frameworks through which the darkened sky might be understood not merely as a passing curiosity, but as a prompt toward deeper spiritual reckoning. One might picture villagers gathered in modest chapels across central Italy or the wooded borders further north. Priests or travelling friars drew upon familiar passages from Scripture to suggest that the heavens, always under divine oversight, could serve as messengers of guidance or gentle correction. When the ordinary patterns of light gave way to something less expected, what? Such explanations from the Church tended to blend observation with reassurance, emphasizing that the event invited reflection on human frailty rather than despair, and that the same power responsible for the cycles of sun and moon could restore them in due time, much as the seasons themselves returned after periods of want or abundance. This approach allowed communities to navigate the uncertainty with a measure of continuity. Sermons might have explored how celestial shifts echoed the broader order described in ancient texts, where signs in the skies were woven into narratives of covenant and renewal without implying immediate upheaval. In monastic settings, where the discipline of prayer intersected with the recording of natural phenomena, the phenomenon could prompt extended discussions among clergy about the balance between wonder at creation's vastness and the call to humility, fostering an atmosphere in which the absence of familiar light for contemplating the enduring presence that sustained all things. The range of these clerical responses varied with local circumstances, from those who saw an opportunity to strengthen communal bonds through shared vigils to others, who focused on the interpretive traditions that linked the visible world to invisible truths, always leaving room for individual listeners to find their own measure of peace amid the questions that lingered. Apocalyptic interpretations surfaced in some quarters as well. Though often tempered by the measured tone of medieval Christianity, fears of the end times drew from prophetic books, yet remained intertwined with hopes of redemption, rather than outright alarm. One can imagine whispered in rural gatherings, or more formal addresses in larger ecclesiastical centres might have connected the moon's pallor to passages describing darkened celestial bodies as harbingers of transition, inviting listeners to consider their own lives in light of eternal perspectives, without asserting that the moment marked a definitive threshold. Such ideas, such clees slowly through pilgrimage routes and letters between religious houses to blend with existing concerns about harvests or distant conflicts, creating narratives that encourage penance or charitable acts as ways to align with the divine will, all while the light's eventual return reinforced a sense of provisional rather than final judgment. Possibilities here remained open, shaped by the teller's own temperament and the audience's recent experiences, allowing apocalyptic threads to coexist with more everyday reflections on resilience and the rhythms that persisted beyond any single night. Religious leaders across the continent responded in ways that reflected their positions within the broader tapestry of faith and authority. Bishops in urban centres, perhaps issuing calls for collective prayer that echoed through stone cathedrals, while local priests in isolated hamlets offered simpler words of comfort drawn from daily homilies. In the eastern reaches, where traditions met along trade paths, figures influenced by both Latin and Byzantine currents might have framed the event through lenses of divine mystery, noting how such occurrences tested, yet ultimately affirmed, the spiritual foundations that guided communities through uncertainty. These responses often emphasized prophecy's role as a bridge between the seen and unseen, where biblical accounts of signs in the heavens served not as rigid predictions, but as invitations to ongoing discernment, encouraging the faithful to view the darkened moon as a reminder of the need for vigilance in matters of the soul, rather than a cause for withdrawal from the world's responsibilities. The role of prophecy in medieval Christianity thus wove itself into these interpretations with a subtlety that honoured both inherited texts and lived experience, allowing individuals to explore connections between celestial events and spiritual meaning without demanding certainty about their precise import. One might picture families in the quiet of their homes or small assemblies, in chapels turning over verses that spoke of light, withdrawn as a call to inner illumination, fostering conversations that linked the night's strangeness to personal journeys of faith, doubt and renewal. Such connections could manifest in extended times of contemplation or modest acts of devotion, like additional offerings or shared readings, that wove the event into the fabric of ongoing spiritual life rather than isolating it as an anomaly across regions. From the fertile plains where agricultural cycles intertwined with liturgical ones, to the rugged coasts where seafarers carried similar questions. These prophetic reflections added layers of meaning that supported endurance, transforming potential unease into opportunities for deeper appreciation of the order that, though occasionally veiled, continued to uphold existence. Accounts of these interpretations travelled along the same paths that Taud carried news of the eclipse itself. They evolved in dialogue with local customs and recent histories, sometimes amplifying themes of judgment in areas marked by recent hardships while softening them in places of relative stability. Clergy and lay people alike might have found in the phenomenon a prompt to revisit foundational stories of creation and providence, where the moon's familiar presence stood as a symbol of constancy that, when altered, highlighted the grace underlying all change. This process of connection between the celestial and the spiritual unfolded gradually, much like the seasonal movements of people and ideas, with each retelling preserving a balance between the momentary disruption and the restoration that followed, thereby contributing to a cultural habit of approaching the unknown with reflective calm. In noble courts or monastic scriptoria, discussions among leaders could extend these ideas further, considering how such signs might influence the moral climate of realms, without veering into speculation that unsettled the social order, instead reinforcing the idea that earthly powers operated within a larger divine framework. The spectrum of responses among religious figures thus ranged from those who integrated the event seamlessly into existing teachings on divine care, to others who used it as a gentle spur toward renewed commitment, always mindful of the diversity of listeners who carried their own burdens and hopes into the conversation. In this way, the interpretations avoided any single dominant narrative, instead allowing for a multiplicity that mirrored the varied landscapes across which the news spread, from shadowed forests where ancient oaks stood witness to open fields where stars reclaimed the sky. Prophecy here functioned as a living thread, linking the 11 and 10 occurrence to earlier accounts of similar phenomena in ways that invited curiosity about the patterns of history and faith, without claiming exhaustive knowledge of their ultimate significance. Communities might have emerged from these reflections, with a quiet strength and resolve, resuming their routines under returning light, while carrying forward a subtle awareness that the heavens, like the human heart, held spaces for both mystery and reassurance. Extending such considerations to the broader ecclesiastical networks that bound medieval Europe, one finds how Letters and oral reports facilitated the exchange of these spiritual insights, enabling a shared exploration that transcended immediate locales, yet remained rooted in personal encounter. The connections drawn between celestial events and spiritual meaning often centered on themes of humility and trust, suggesting that the moon's withdrawal served as an emblem of the soul's occasional need for darkness to appreciate light anew, perspective that could ease fears while sparking gentle wonder at the intricacies of creation. This approach proved evident in the careful annals and homiletic traditions of the era, preserved the event as part of an ongoing dialogue between the visible world and unseen realities that gave it depth, encouraging later reflections without imposing final interpretations. Through all these layers, religious dimensions of the Eventen eclipse contributed to the resilience that allowed societies to move forward, transforming a night of altered skies into a thread within the larger story of faith, of Gore's capacity to accompany humanity through uncertainty toward renewed equilibrium. In villages near ancient pilgrimage sites, where the air carried echoes of countless journeys, the interpretations might have taken on an especially poignant tone, with leaders invoking prophetic imagery to frame the darkness as a call for, in a pilgrimage, a turning toward the light within that no external shadow could extinguish. Such ideas, exchanged in the measured cadences of prayer or the intimate settings of confession, wove celestial observation into the daily practice of belief, allowing individuals to find personal resonance without the pressure of collective consensus. The Church's overarching explanations, grounded in a worldview that saw all creation as expressive of divine intent, thus provided a steadying influence amid the varied responses, from quiet awe to tentative apprehension, always pointing toward the possibility of restoration as evidence of sustaining grace. As these threads continued their circulation through the interconnected web of religious houses and lay communities, they enriched the cultural memory of the event, adding dimensions of spiritual inquiry that complemented the immediate human reactions without overshadowing them. One can reflect on how this interplay between prophecy and lived experience fostered a sense of continuity, where the moon's return after its unusual dimming mirrored the cycles of repentance and forgiveness central to medieval Christianity, inviting ongoing contemplation rather than closure. Across the continent's diverse settings, from bustling ports alive with merchant voices to secluded valleys where only the wind spoke, the religious interpretations adapted to local rhythms, ensuring that the phenomenon served as a bridge to deeper meaning rather than a barrier. This gradual unfolding preserved the event's place within a tradition that valued both the mystery of the heavens and the steadfastness of faith, allowing communities to carry forward a calm awareness of forces beyond full human grasp, yet intimately connected to the soul's journey. In this manner, the fears and hopes stirred by the eclipse found expression through channels that emphasized endurance and reflection, contributing to the quiet strength that defined the era's response to the unknown. In the quiet continuation of those same reflections that wove celestial signs into the enduring patterns of faith and daily endurance, one might turn attention toward the measured record preserved in monastic houses further to the north, where the same night of altered skies found its way into annals that bridged the seen and the remembered with a simplicity that still invites contemplation. The Peterborough Chronicle, as one of the later extensions of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, compiled at the Abbey in eastern England, stands as a particularly resonant example of how such events entered written memory, its pages offering a window into the early 12th century that remains valuable. Precisely because it blends observation with the rhythms of monastic life under the reign of Henry I. This continuation, maintained by scribes who carried forward a tradition rooted in earlier centuries yet, adapted to the linguistic and political shifts after the Norman arrival, holds significance, not merely for its survival, but for the way it captures phenomena that might otherwise have faded into oral recollection alone, allowing later generations to sense the texture of uncertainty as it unfolded in a landscape of fens, rivers, scattered settlements, where the moon's cycles guided both prayer and labour. The specific entry for the year 1110 describes the moon, Myon, in terms that linger with a quiet precision, noting how it appeared bright and full through much of the night before it suddenly withdrew its light entirely, leaving the heavens without the familiar glow and the stars alone. To mark the darkness, Count, whose wording emphasized the abruptness and completeness of the change, rather than any accompanying spectacle of colour or shadow. One can linger over the phrasing which avoids elaborate interpretation, and instead lingers on the observable sequence. The initial presence of light, giving way to an absence so total that it prompted remark, suggesting a chronicler attuned to the ordinary expectations of the night and sky, and thus struck by the departure from them. Such wording, spare yet evocative in its restraint, stands apart from more embellished descriptions in continental sources that might have layered omens or portents more explicitly, and it invites reflection on how the scribe, writing perhaps from direct report or communal memory within the abbey walls, chose to record the event as a disruption in the expected order without pressing toward conclusions that might unsettle the balance between wonder and acceptance. This account proves unusual within the broader tradition of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, because it devotes attention to a celestial occurrence, at a moment when entries more commonly centred on the affairs of kings, the movements of armies, or the deaths of notable figures. A shift that hints at the scribe's willingness to include natural anomalies as part of the year's record when they disrupted the accustomed flow of light and time. In an era when annals often served to anchor communal identity amid political transitions, the inclusion of such details suggests a recognition that the heavens themselves formed part of the shared experience worth preserving, especially when the phenomenon extended across regions and reached ears through travellers or letters that connected Peterborough to wider networks. The unusual quality emerges further in the absence of overt moralizing, allowing the description to stand as an observation that later readers might interpret through their own lenses of faith or curiosity, rather than as a directive toward immediate penitence or alarm, thereby preserving a space for the event to resonate as both historical marker and prompt for ongoing reflection. What the chronicler chose to emphasize appears to rest on the contrast between expectation and reality, highlighting the moon's initial visibility, followed by its total withdrawal, and the resulting darkness that left no trace of its usual illumination. Focus that draws attention to the reliability of natural patterns, even as it acknowledges their occasional suspension. This emphasis might reflect the scribe's position within a community where timekeeping through lunar phases intersected with liturgical observances, making the disappearance not simply a curiosity, but a matter that touched the ordering of hours and vigils. Yet the account stops short of linking it directly to divine displeasure or future calamity, instead leaving room for the reader to sense the event's place within a larger continuity that ultimately saw the light return. Such choices in emphasis could stem from the chronicler's access to reports from across England, or even from continental exchanges where similar observations circulated, allowing the entry to function as a local anchor for a phenomenon experienced more widely. And they underscore a historiographical approach that valued fidelity to what was seen or heard over speculative elaboration placed within its historical context. The Peterborough Chronicle's record of the 1110 event unfolds amid the consolidation of Norman rule in England, period marked by the building monasteries and cathedrals that served as centres of learning and record-keeping, while also navigating tensions between royal authority and ecclesiastical independence. Conditions that shaped how anomalies in the sky were noted alongside more terrestrial concerns like harvests, disputes over lands, or the succession questions that would later surface. The Chronicle itself, transitioning from Old English toward the influences of Latin and emerging vernacular forms, embodies this era of cultural layering where accounts of celestial shifts could coexist with entries on abbatial elections or royal progresses, without demanding resolution into a single narrative of meaning. One might picture the scribe at work in the scriptorium, perhaps drawing on conversations with visiting monks or pilgrims who carried news from southern regions, integrating the moon's disappearance into a tapestry that already included reflections on providence and order, thereby contributing to a historical memory that honoured both the stability of institutions and the mysteries that occasionally tested human understanding. In this setting, the account gains depth from its surroundings, the same monastic environment that preserved earlier chronicle traditions now extended them to encompass an eclipse whose strangeness invited precisely the kind of measured contemplation that aligned with the spiritual disciplines of the house, fostering a record that later ages could revisit for insights into how medieval communities held space for both the predictable cycles and their unexpected interruptions. Extending such considerations, the Chronicle's entry resonates with the broader European circulation of reports about the darkened moon, yet it retains a distinct English inflection shaped by the abbey's location amid wetlands, where clear nights offered unobstructed views of the heavens, potentially heightening the impact of any alteration in familiar patterns. The significance of the Peterborough continuation lies also in its role as one of the final sustained efforts in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle tradition, bridging the pre-conquest past with the realities of the 12th century, and thereby ensuring that observations like this one endured beyond immediate oral transmission, offering a thread of continuity that paralleled the religious interpretations unfolding in chapels and courts elsewhere. Through its wording and emphasis, the account subtly underscores the value placed on accurate recollection within monastic culture, where the act of writing itself served as an affirmation that even moments of darkness formed part of a story worth carrying forward, always with an openness to the restoration that followed, and the lessons that might emerge from quiet endurance rather than from definitive pronouncements. As these written traces connected to the lived experiences of those who witnessed or heard of the event, they enrich the cultural fabric. A cultural fabric by providing a textual counterpart to the prophetic reflections and communal responses already circulating, allowing the 1110 occurrence to occupy a place in memory that balanced factual observation with the interpretive possibilities left open for future readers. The chronicler's restraint in avoiding excessive elaboration mirrors the tempering of apocalyptic tones noted in religious discourse, suggesting a shared inclination across different modes of recording to approach the unknown with a composure rooted in the expectation of eventual turn to accustomed rhythms. In this way, the Peterborough Chronicle account contributes not as an isolated fragment, but as an integral element within the larger dialogue between observation, faith, and historical preservation, inviting ongoing curiosity about how such nights shaped the inner landscapes of those who navigated them, without claiming to exhaust their significance or to fix their meaning in any single framework. The legacy of this particular entry thus extends through its capacity to evoke the quiet astonishment of the moment, while anchoring it within the steady work of chronicling that sustained communities through seasons of both light and temporary withdrawal, fostering a sense of resilience that echoed across the varied terrains of medieval Europe, in the quiet continuation of those same reflections that wove celestial signs into the enduring patterns of faith and daily endurance. One might turn attention toward the broader rhythms of the earth itself. The altered skies of 111010 could be seen as part of a longer sequence of atmospheric changes that unfolded across the early decades of the 12th century and invited chroniclers and later observers alike to consider how the heavens and the soil together shaped the conditions of life somewhere in central Italy. If one could stand on a hillside on a quiet night and look out over the dark valleys below, the olive trees might appear as ancient witnesses to cycles of abundance and scarcity that extended far beyond any single eclipse, their gnarled forms holding within their growth the subtle marks of seasons. When the expected warmth gave way to prolonged chill, shift that began to register in records from monastic houses and manorial accounts around this very time. Such a cold period, emerging in the years following the documented disappearance of the moon, presented itself not as an abrupt catastrophe, but as a gradual alteration in the patterns of frost and thaw, one that chroniclers noted through references to extended winters and delayed springs without attributing it directly to any particular celestial event, thereby leaving space for later generations to ponder the possible connections between momentary darkenings in the night sky and more sustained shifts in the climate that affected harvests across regions from the Italian peninsula to the English fens. This era of cooling, as it might be traced through scattered annals and the indirect testimony of agricultural yields, coincided with reports of volcanic activity in distant quarters of the world, where eruptions could release fine particles into the upper atmosphere that lingered and dimmed the sun's rays for months or for even years afterward, creating conditions under which an eclipse might appear all the more striking. Because the baseline light was already reduced, classed, one could reflect on how such volcanic contributions remained matters of speculation rather than established fact in the medieval mind. Yet, the coincidence invited contemplation among those who observed. Both the sudden withdrawal of lunar light and the subsequent persistence of hazy days when the sun itself seemed veiled, as if the two phenomena shared an underlying atmospheric disturbance that chroniclers recorded side by side in their entries on natural wonders. Theories linking eclipses to volcanic dust thus emerged not as firm conclusions, but as possibilities that allowed monastic writers to connect the visible anomaly of 1110 with wider reports of dust veils or reddened skies in other seasons, fostering a sense of the interconnectedness of earthly and celestial realms without pressing toward any single explanation that might overshadow the simple endurance required in the fields and cloisters. As these atmospheric possibilities unfolded, the lands began to register the effects through diminished growing seasons. Crops that had once ripened reliably deal under accustomed warmth now struggled against late frosts and shortened summers, leading in some regions to outright failures that chroniclers described in measured terms as times when the barn stood emptier than expected, and the labour of sowing yielded less than the effort invested. Such crop shortfalls, following closely upon the years around 1110, unfolded gradually, rather than as immediate consequences, allowing communities to draw upon reserves from better harvests, while also prompting reflections on divine providence or the need for careful stewardship. Themes that resonated with the same monastic traditions that preserved accounts, the moon's vanishing. Famines that emerged in the wake of these difficulties did not strike uniformly, but appeared in localized intensities, particularly where poor soils or disrupted trade routes compounded the challenges of a cooler climate, and the records from places like the Peterborough Abbey lands hint at the quiet adjustments in almsgiving and prayer that accompanied these periods, inviting later readers to sense how the eclipse's darkness might have echoed in the longer shadows cast over the harvest cycles, without claiming any direct line of cause from one to the other. Preserved in the wood of ancient trees, offer another layer of invitation to reflection, as the narrow growth rings from specimens spanning the early 12th century reveal sequences of years, when growth slowed markedly, consistent with cooler temperatures that limited the period of active photosynthesis, and left their mark in the annual increments of trunks that still stand or lie, preserved in bogs and cathedrals. These tree ring patterns, examined centuries later through careful measurement and comparison across multiple sites from northern Europe to the Mediterranean, suggest a clustering of colder conditions beginning around I1110 and extending for several decades, signal that aligns temporally with the eclipse reports, yet remains open to interpretation regarding whether volcanic aerosols, solar variations, other factors played the greater role in sustaining the chill. One might linger over the evidence of such data as a form of silent chronicle of a crowd, a host, where the trees themselves recorded the atmospheric conditions in a language of density and width that complements the written words of the Anglo-Saxon continuators, allowing modern observers to sense the texture of those seasons while recognizing that the rings indicate correlation with cooler weather rather than confirming any singular cause tied to the lunar event itself. Other forms of proxy evidence, including layers in ice cores from distant glaciers and sediment deposits in lakes, similarly point toward on a period of reduced temperatures and altered precipitation patterns that began to manifest around this era, with some samples showing increased acidity that could hint at volcanic inputs, without establishing them as the sole driver. Such findings invite contemplation on how the world of 1110 existed within a broader climatic fluctuation that medieval communities navigated through adaptation, rather than through any articulated theory of global mechanisms, responses ranging from intensified prayers for clement weather to shifts in planting to schedules that reflected accumulated experience rather than sudden alarm. The connection between eclipses and volcanic activity thus stands as one thread among several that might be followed through these records, a possibility that gains resonance from the timing of known eruptions elsewhere, but stops short of asserting that the darkened moon of that year resulted directly from such dust, instead encouraging reflection on the atmosphere as a shared medium through which multiple influences could converge and produce the observed anomalies in light and growth. In this light, crop failures and ensuing famines appear not as isolated disasters, but as extensions of the same atmospheric uncertainties that made the eclipse noteworthy, with monastic and manorial accounts noting instances of spoiled grain or stunted vines in terms that blend observation with acceptance of the unpredictable bounty of the earth. These difficulties unfolding over the subsequent years prompted communal measures, such as the distribution of stored provisions or appeals to neighbouring regions, all within a framework where the memory of the moon's withdrawal could serve as a quiet reminder of how quickly familiar patterns might alter, yet without the chronicles pressing any causal link that would transform the event into a harbinger of famine specifically. Tree ring data and related evidence thus serve to enrich the picture by providing quantitative hints of the cooling trend, their narrow bands standing as counterparts to the verbal descriptions. In the Peterborough continuation, forms of record, preserving the sense that 1110 marked a point where celestial and terrestrial conditions intersected in ways that invited ongoing curiosity rather than definitive resolution. Theories surrounding these climate anomalies therefore remain avenues for reflection, encompassing the potential role of distant volcanic eruptions in scattering particles that could enhance the visibility or impact of an eclipse, while also contributing to cooler summer, alongside considerations of solar output variations or oceanic circulation shifts that might have operated independently. Such possibilities drawn from the alignment of dates and proxy measurements allow one to imagine how a scribe in an English abbey or an observer on an Italian hillside might have sensed a world in which the night sky and the fields shared a common vulnerability to fostering forces, fostering resilience through the steady rhythms of prayer, labour and record-keeping that characterized the era. The absence of absolute claims in these interpretations mirrors the restraint seen in the Chronicle itself, where the moon's disappearance was noted for its observable qualities rather than its presumed meanings, thereby opening space for later explorations of climate connections that honour the complexity of the historical moment, without reducing it to any single narrative of causation. Extending these considerations further into the landscape of early 12th century Europe, one finds that the Cold Period's effects manifested differently across varied terrains, upland areas, perhaps experiencing more pronounced frost damage to early plantings, while river valleys retained some moisture that mitigated the worst shortfalls, conditions that the monastic networks documented through letters and visitations that connected distant houses in a web of shared awareness. This regional variation underscores how the anomalies of the era invited localized adaptations, from changes in the types of grains sown to adjustments in the timing of festivals tied to the agricultural calendar, all while the memory of the 1110 eclipse lingered as a point of reference for discussions of altered skies and their possible earthly echoes. In this way, the scientific evidence from tree rings and other sources complements the human records by adding layers of measurable data that invite contemplation on the scale of the changes, revealing a period when temperatures may have dipped enough. Everything from vine cultivation in southern regions to the duration of winter fodder needs in the north, yet always within a framework of possibility rather than certainty that aligns with the sleep-friendly invitation to reflect on history's quieter dimensions. The interplay between these climatic shifts and the documented celestial event thus continues to spark curiosity about the medieval experience of the natural world, where an eclipse could coincide with emerging patterns of cooling without the two being linked in any asserted chain events, allowing the chronicles and the proxy data alike to stand as parallel testimonies to a time when darkness in the heavens and cooler conditions on the earth both tested and reinforced the communal endurance that defined the period. As one lingers over these elements, the sense emerges of a history that unfolds through gradual accumulations rather than dramatic ruptures, with the cold period beginning around 1110 serving as a backdrop, against which the eclipse's strangeness could be appreciated in its full atmospheric context, fostering reflection that connect the immediate reactions preserved in annals to the longer arc of environmental change, without claiming to resolve the underlying questions of cause and coincidence. In the quiet continuation of those same reflections that wove celestial signs into the enduring patterns of faith and daily endurance, one might turn attention toward the spheres of governance and authority, where the altered skies of 1110 could be seen as intersecting with the fragile balances of power that defined early 12th century realms, inviting chroniclers and later observers alike to consider how the heavens and the ambitions of rulers together shaped the conditions of legitimacy, conflict, without pressing any direct attribution. Somewhere in central Italy or across the Norman domains of England and Normandy, if one could stand on a hillside on a quiet night and look out over the dark valleys below, the olive trees or the scattered manors might appear as ancient witnesses to cycles of allegiance and rivalry that extended far beyond any single eclipse, their enduring forms holding within their shadows the subtle marks of seasons when expected stability gave way to prolonged uncertainty, a shift that began to register in records from royal courts and monastic houses this very time. Such a period of political tension emerging in the years following the documented disappearance of the moon, presented itself not as an abrupt upheaval, but as a gradual alteration in the patterns of loyalty and succession, one that chroniclers noted through references to disputed claims and uneasy truce ends, without attributing it directly to any particular celestial event, thereby leaving space for later generations to ponder the possible connections between momentary darkenings in the night sky and more sustained shifts in authority that affected alliances across regions from the Italian peninsula to the English shires. This era of instability, as it might be traced through scattered annals and the indirect testimony of royal charters, coincided with reports of contested thrones in distant quarters of the world. Questions of inheritance could linger in the minds of nobles and clergy alike, and render an eclipse all the more striking, because the baseline accepted order was already unsettled. One could reflect on how such political uncertainties remained matters of speculation rather than established fact in the medieval mind. Yet the coincidence invited contemplation among those who observed both the sudden withdrawal of lunar light and the subsequent persistence of uneasy rains when the claims of kings themselves seemed veiled, as if the two phenomena shared an underlying disturbance that chroniclers recorded side by side in their entries on natural wonders and princely deeds. Theories linking eclipses to challenges against legitimacy thus emerged not as firm conclusions, but as possibilities that allowed monastic writers to connect the visible anomaly of 1110 with wider reports of succession disputes or border skirmishes in other seasons, fostering a sense of the interconnectedness of earthly and celestial realms with celestial realms, without best toward any single explanation that might overshadow the simple endurance required in the halls of power and the cloisters. As these political possibilities unfolded, the lands began to register the effects through diminished confidence in rulers, where alliances that had once held reliably under accustomed customs now struggled against late challenges and shortened periods of peace, leading in some regions to outright rivalries that chroniclers described in measured terms as times when the oaths stood emptier than expected, and the labour of negotiation yielded less than the effort invested. Such tensions, following closely upon the years around 1110, folded, gradually rather than as immediate consequences, allowing communities to draw upon reserves of tradition from steadier times, while also prompting reflections on divine favour, or the need for careful stewardship themes that resonated with the same monastic traditions that preserved accounts of the moon's vanishing disputes that emerged in the wake of these difficulties did not strike uniformly, but appeared in localized intensities, particularly where contested inheritances or disrupted feudal ties compounded the challenges of a realm already navigating cooler conditions, and the records from places like the English abbeys hint at the quiet adjustments in counsel and prayer that accompanied these periods of uncertainty, inviting later readers to sense how the eclipse's darkness might have echoed in the longer shadows cast over the structures of authority, without claiming any direct line of cause from one to the other. Royal responses, preserved in the fragments of charters and correspondence, offer another layer of invitation to reflection, as the cautious language from courts spanning the early 12th century reveals sequences of years when declarations of divine right slowed markedly, consistent with cooler political temperatures that limited the period of unchallenged rule and left their mark in the annual increments of loyalty that still echo in surviving documents from cathedrals and archives. These patterns of restraint, examined centuries later through careful comparison, across multiple sites from northern Europe to the Mediterranean, suggest a clustering of contested successions beginning around 1110 and extending for several decades, signal that aligns temporally with the eclipse. Reports yet remains open to interpretation regarding whether celestial omens, internal rivalries, or other factors played the greater role in sustaining the unease. One might linger over the evidence of such records as a form of silent chronicle, where the rulers themselves navigated the atmospheric conditions in a language of proclamation and concessions that complements the written words of the Anglo-Saxon continuators, allowing modern observers to sense the texture of those seasons, while recognizing that the accounts indicate correlation with political cooling rather than confirming any singular cause tied to the lunar event itself. Other forms of testimony, including accounts from distant imperial courts and regional assemblies, similarly point toward a period of reduced certainty and altered allegiances that began to manifest around this era. Some documents showing heightened references to portents that could hint at challenges to authority, without establishing them as the sole driver. Such findings invite contemplation on how the world of 1110 existed within a broad fluctuation of power that medieval leaders navigated through adaptation rather than through any articulated theory of cosmic mechanisms, their responses ranging from intensified appeals to divine sanction, to shifts in marriage alliances that reflected accumulated experience rather than sudden alarm. The connection between eclipses and threats to legitimacy thus stands as one thread among several that might be followed through these records, a possibility that gains resonance from the timing of known disputes elsewhere, but stops short of asserting that the darkened moon of that year resulted directly from such tensions. Instead, encouraging reflection on authority as a shared medium through which multiple influences could converge and produce the observed anomalies in rule and reaction. In this light, the succession crises and ensuing conflicts appear not as isolated upheavals but as extensions of the same uncertainties that made the eclipse noteworthy with royal and ecclesiastical accounts, noting instances of question claims or stalled campaigns in terms that blend observation with acceptance of the unpredictable bounty of fortune. These difficulties unfolding over the subsequent years prompted communal measures such as the distribution of favours or appeals to neighbouring powers, all within a framework where the memory of the moon's withdrawal could serve as a quiet reminder of how quickly familiar patterns of loyalty might alter, yet without the chronicles pressing any causal link that would transform the event into a harbinger of rebellion, specifically charter data and related evidence, thus serve to enrich the picture by providing qualitative hints of the cooling trend in authority. Cautious phrases standing as counterparts to the verbal descriptions in the Peterborough continuation forms of record, preserving the sense that 1110 marked a point where celestial and terrestrial conditions intersected in ways that invited ongoing curiosity rather than definitive resolution. Theories surrounding these political anomalies therefore remain avenues for reflection, encompassing the potential role of distant rivalries in scattering doubts that could enhance the visibility or impact of an eclipse while also contributing to cooler periods of stability, alongside considerations of papal interventions or dynastic shifts that might have operated independently. Such possibilities, drawn from the alignment of dates and documentary measurements, allow one to imagine how a scribe in an English abbey or an observer on an Italian hillside might have sensed a world in which the night sky and the thrones shared a common vulnerability to unseen forces, fostering resilience through the steady rhythms of council, alliance, and record-keeping that characterized the era. The absence of absolute claims in these interpretations mirrors the restraint seen in the Chronicle itself, where the moon's disappearance was noted for its observable qualities rather than its presumed meanings, thereby opening space for later explorations of political connections and the complexity of the historical moment, without reducing it to any single narrative of causation. Extending these considerations further into the landscape of early 12th century Europe, one finds that the effects of instability manifested differently across varied terrains of power, upland baronies, perhaps experiencing more pronounced challenges to early claims, while river valleys retained some continuity that mitigated the worst fractures, conditions that the monastic networks documented through letters and visitations that connected distant houses in a web of shared awareness. This regional variation underscores how the anomalies of the era invited localized adaptations, from changes in the types of oaths sworn to adjustments in the timing of assemblies tied to the feudal calendar, all while the memory of the 1110 eclipse lingered as a point of reference for discussions of altered skies and their possible earthly echoes. In this way, the evidence from chronicles and other sources complements the human records by adding layers of measurable detail that invite contemplation on the scale of the changes, revealing a period when temperatures of authority may have dipped enough to influence everything from imperial negotiations in southern regions to the duration of winter councils in the north, yet always within a framework of possibility, rather than certainty, that aligns with the sleep-friendly invitation to reflect on history's quieter dimensions, the interplay between these political shifts and the documented celestial event, thus continues to spark curiosity about the medieval experience of the natural world, where an eclipse could coincide with emerging patterns of contested rule without the two being linked in any asserted chain of events, allowing the chronicles and the proxy testimonies alike to stand as parallel accounts to a time when darkness in the heavens and cooler conditions in the courts both tested and reinforced the communal endurance that defined the period. As one lingers over these elements, the sense emerges of a history that unfolds through gradual accumulations rather than dramatic ruptures, period of instability beginning around 1110 serving as a backdrop against which the eclipse's strangeness could be appreciated in its full atmospheric context, fostering reflections that connect the immediate reactions preserved in annals to the longer arc of power without claiming to resolve the underlying questions of cause and coincidence. Rulers of the time navigating these intersections might have responded by reinforcing their claims through additional pious foundations or public displays of continuity. Yet, the records leave room to consider whether such measures stem from a perception of celestial warning or simply from the ongoing need to secure port amid the same climatic pressures that had already begun to strain resources in the fields below. One could further reflect on how the eclipse might have touched questions of legitimacy in realms where succession remained delicate, as in the Norman holdings, where the absence of clear heirs invited speculation that any unusual sign could be read as commentary on the fitness of a line, though chroniclers recorded such thoughts in indirect terms that preserved the mystery, rather than resolving it into accusation. Possibility that leaders attributed military setbacks or diplomatic failures to the lunar withdrawal invites gentle consideration of how cosmic fears could be woven into narratives of earthly struggle, allowing a defeated campaign or a faltering alliance to be framed not solely as human error, but as part of a larger pattern in which the heavens themselves participated in the testing of power. In the broader conflicts of the era, including those between secular and ecclesiastical authorities over investiture, the darkened moon offered a shared reference point that both the sides might have invoked to underscore their own interpretations of divine will, thereby connecting the event to struggles for control without establishing it as a decisive factor in any particular outcome. Such connections between the celestial and the political thus unfold as threads of possibility that enrich the tapestry of endurance, where the same monastic houses that noted the eclipse also preserved accounts of royal movements and baronial negotiations, their parallel entries suggesting a world in which the withdrawal of light and the shifting of thrones invited ongoing reflection on the limits of human authority. The gradual nature of these intersections, emerging across years rather than in a single moment, allowed communities to adapt through familiar practices of counsel and prayer, their responses shaped by accumulated wisdom rather than by any sudden conviction that the eclipse had altered the course of rule. In this manner, a section of history surrounding 1110 continues to offer avenues for quiet contemplation, where the interplay of instability and celestial wonder stands as an invitation to appreciate the measured pace at which both earthly powers and heavenly signs reveal their deeper rhythms. Somewhere in the quiet unfolding of centuries that followed the year 1110, one could imagine here standing once more upon that same Italian hillside, or pausing beside the scriptorium where the Peterborough chronicler set down his measured words. The darkened moon might begin to reveal itself not as an isolated wonder, but as a thread in a longer weave of inquiry that, later, astronomers would take up with instruments and calculations refined across generations, allowing the event to be revisited through the lens of accumulated records rather than immediate fear. Crag. One might reflect on how scholars in the Renaissance and beyond, poring over monastic annals from England and scattered European houses, began to trace the eclipse reports of that winter with fresh eyes, comparing the descriptions of a moon that withdrew its light entirely for a span, nights, against the predictable cycles of lunar passages that Ptolemaic models and later Copernican adjustments had begun to map more precisely, thereby opening space for the possibility that atmospheric veils, rather than divine intervention alone, could account for the prolonged obscurity. without pressing any single conclusion, that might eclipse the simple endurance of observation itself. This gradual rediscovery invited contemplation on what the medieval accounts could teach about the behaviour of air and particles suspended high above the earth, where the same chronicles that noted the moon's vanishing alongside reports of unseasonable cold and dimmed sunlight hinted at layers of dust or vapour that might scatter or absorb lunar radiance in ways that extended the darkness beyond the usual duration of an ordinary eclipse, fostering reflections on how such atmospheric conditions could linger through seasons and connect the visible anomaly of 1110 to broader patterns of climatic fluctuation that proxy evidence from tree rings and ice cores would later suggest. Without asserting any definitive causal chain, theories surrounding these atmospheric insights thus emerged not as firm assertions but as avenues for quiet consideration, where the event's strangeness encouraged later natural philosophers to ponder the interplay between celestial mechanics and terrestrial mists, allowing the medieval testimony to stand alongside emerging studies of refraction and scattering that illuminated how fine particles from distant volcanic activity or other sources might veil the heavens in a manner consistent with the chronicle's emphasis on observable qualities rather than presumed meanings. As these explorations progressed through the 17th and 18th centuries, astronomers, equipped with telescopes and logarithmic tables, revisited the 1110 records with an eye toward reconciling them against Newtonian principles of orbital motion, discovering in the process that the eclipse's reported persistence aligned with periods when the moon passed through the Earth's shadow under conditions of heightened turbidity, thereby connecting the ancient observations to a more nuanced understanding of how the atmosphere could modulate light without diminishing the wonder that first prompted the monastic scribes to note the phenomenon amid their entries on natural wonders. One could linger over the possibility that this event, preserved in its indirect testimony across multiple sites, served as a catalyst for the gradual shift from purely astrological interpretations toward empirical inquiry, where the same monastic networks that transmitted the accounts also preserved fragments of classical learning that later generations would recover and extend, inviting reflections on the measured pace at which astronomical knowledge advanced through successive layers of annotation and comparison rather than sudden revelation. The progression of such knowledge unfolded across continents and eras of observers in the Islamic world and later in European academies, drawing upon the 1110 descriptions to refine models of lunar libration and penumbral effects, exploring how the event might illustrate the influence of stratospheric aerosols on visibility in ways that prefigured modern understandings of volcanic winters and their capacity to dim celestial bodies for extended intervals, all while leaving room for the possibility that other factors, such as regional weather patterns or observational vantage points, contributed to the reported variations without establishing any singular explanation that would overshadow the complexity of the historical moment. In this light, the medieval eclipse became a point of reference for connecting past and present inquiries, where the chronicler's plain account of a moon that shined not could be reread through the prism of spectroscopic analysis and satellite data that reveal similar atmospheric interactions in contemporary events, fostering a sense of continuity that honours the endurance of human curiosity across the divide between cloistered scriptoria and observatory domes. Further contemplation arises when one considers how the event prompted rediscoveries in the 19th century. As historians of science sifted through annals to identify the 1110 reports alongside other eclipse anomalies, thereby illuminating pathways by which atmospheric science gained precision through the study of historical dimmings that aligned with known eruptions or climatic shifts, allowing the observations from that year to contribute to theory about global circulation patterns without claiming that they alone resolved long-standing questions of cause and coincidence. Such connections between medieval testimony and later frameworks encouraged reflections on the limits of early knowledge, where the absence of telescopic confirmation meant that the chroniclers recorded what their senses perceived, opening avenues for subsequent generations to layer instrumental measurements atop those foundations of Bergemarsmund, a manner that preserved the original strangeness while expanding its interpretive reach. Theories linking the eclipses to broader lessons in atmospheric dynamics thus stand as threads among many, gaining resonance from the alignment of dates with other proxy records, yet remaining open to interpretation regarding the relative weights of dust loading, orbital geometry, or local conditions in sustaining the observed darkness. One might imagine how an astronomer in the age of Halley or Cassini, consulting the Anglo-Saxon continuation alongside continental sources, could sense in the 1110 accounts an invitation to test hypotheses about light transmission through variable media, thereby advancing the progression from geocentric certainties toward heliocentric models that better accounted for the mechanics of eclipses, while still accommodating the role of transient atmospheric phenomena figurae in modulating their apparent duration. This, of understanding, unfolded gradually, mirroring the slow accumulation of evidence in the political and climatic spheres discussed in earlier reflections, where the eclipse's memory lingered as a quiet prompt for adaptation rather than abrupt transformation, allowing communities of inquiry to draw upon reserves of tradition from steadier eras of scholarship, while prompting new questions about the interconnectedness of earth and sky. Extending these considerations into the 20th century and beyond, the event finds renewed relevance in studies that employ computational reconstructions, computational rails to simulate the atmospheric conditions of 1110, connecting the medieval descriptions to contemporary insights on aerosol chemistry and radiative forcing prose. Without asserting that any single simulation captures the full texture of what observers experience on those nights when the moon withdrew its light, possibility that such modelling could illuminate pathways by which the eclipse contributed to the foundations of atmospheric science invites gentle consideration of how observatorial records from distant times continue to enrich modern frameworks, cautious phrases standing as counterparts to quantitative data that reveal correlations with volcanic or climatic episodes. Yet, stop short of confirming any isolated driver tied solely to the lunar event itself. In this manner, the scientific rediscovery of 1110 unfolds as an extension of the same uncertainties that made the eclipse noteworthy in its own era. Each generation navigating the intersections of recorded anomaly, and emerging theory through measured inquiry rather than definitive resolution, thereby fostering resilience in the pursuit of knowledge that echoes the communal endurance preserved in the chronicles. As these layers of interpretation accumulate, the sense emerges of a history of astronomy that advances through patient cross-referencing of sources, spanning the Italian valleys to the English shires, where the event's atmospheric implications could be appreciated in their full context as part of broader fluctuation in celestial visibility that tested and reinforced the observational traditions defining the medieval and post-medieval periods alike. The interplay between these rediscoveries and the documented observations thus continues to spark curiosity about the gradual revelation of natural mechanisms, allowing the 1110 eclipse to serve as a bridge between eras, without reducing its strangeness to any single narrative of scientific triumph. One could further reflect on how the progression of knowledge invited ongoing adjustments in the ways eclipses were anticipated and explained, from the incorporation of atmospheric references in ephemeриdes to the integration of paleoclimatic data that situates the event within longer cycles of environmental change, all while the original accounts retained their capacity to prompt reflections on the limits of certainty in both past and present understandings. Such possibilities, drawn from the alignment of chronicle entries with later instrumental records, allow one to imagine how a scribe noting the moon's withdrawal or a modern researcher modelling its atmospheric veil might have sensed a shared vulnerability to unseen forces that shape both the night sky and the arc of inquiry, fostering a quiet appreciation for the rhythms through which astronomical insight deepens over time. The absence of absolute claims in these explorations mirrors the restraint seen in the medieval sources themselves, where the eclipse was noted for its observable qualities rather than its ultimate causes, thereby opening space for continued contemplation on the connections between historical darkness and contemporary illumination that honour the complexity of the phenomenon without resolving it into any singular framework. In this way, the section of scientific history surrounding 1110 continues to offer avenues for reflection, where the rediscovery of the event stands as an invitation to appreciate the measured pace at which both atmospheric secrets and celestial patterns reveal their deeper interconnections, extending the earlier considerations of political and climatic, substatical and climatic threads into the realm of knowledge itself, without claiming to close the underlying questions of coincidence and discovery. The gradual nature of these scientific intersections, emerging across centuries rather than in isolated moments, allowed successive communities to adapt through familiar practices of record keeping and hypothesis testing, their responses shaped by accumulated wisdom from classical recoveries and Enlightenment empiricism, rather than by any sudden conviction that the eclipse alone transformed the field. Royal and ecclesiastical archives that preserved the initial accounts thus complemented the later astronomical treatises, their parallel testimonies suggesting a world in which the withdrawal of lunar light and the advancement of explanatory models invited ongoing dialogue between observation and theory. Theories surrounding these rediscoveries, therefore, remain open pathways, encompassing the potential contributions of improved optics and global data networks in clarifying the 1110 conditions, while also acknowledging the enduring value of the original descriptions as anchors for reflection on how knowledge progresses amid uncertainty. As one lingers over these elements, the interplay of medieval observation and modern insight emerges as a continuation of the same contemplative stance that characterized responses to the eclipse in its time, where the possibility of atmospheric influence could be weighed alongside orbital mechanics without diminishing the sense of wonder that first prompted the notes in the annals. This measured unfolding invites further consideration of how the event's lessons in atmospheric science continue to resonate in studies of contemporary dimmings, connecting the historical record to ongoing explorations of planetary atmospheres, in ways that preserve the invitation to quiet curiosity rather than resolution. Ultimately, the scientific journey from the 1110 eclipse traces a path of rediscovery that enriches the broader tapestry of endurance across the medieval and subsequent ages, where each layer of inquiry adds texture, without asserting dominance over the others, allowing the darkened moon to echo through the history of astronomy as a reminder of the shared rhythms that link earthly records to celestial phenomena across the expanse of time. In the lingering hush that settled across those same Italian hillsides and the scattered scriptoria, England, after the scientific threads of rediscovery had been gently traced through later centuries, the darkened moon of 1110 began to drift into quieter realms of remembrance, where it no longer served solely as a prompt for atmospheric inquiry, but lingered instead. The stories people told one another beside winter fires, or inscribed in the margins of personal devotions. One might imagine how the event, first noted in measured phrases by monastic scribes, gradually loosened its hold on immediate observation, and entered the softer domain of shared recollection, passing from the precise language of annals into the fluid forms of local tales that wove the vanishing light into warnings about uncertain times or the fragile balance between earth and sky. Such transmission invited reflection on the ways communities preserve the strangeness without claiming to explain it, allowing fragments of the chronicle accounts to surface in oral traditions that spoke of a winter when the heavens selves seemed to pause, perhaps as a gentle reminder of human smallness amid larger rhythms that no single generation could fully grasp. In this manner, the eclipse found its way into folklore, not as a fixed event, but as a shifting presence, sometimes appearing in stories of travellers who lost their way under starless nights or of villages, where elders recalled how the usual comfort of moonlight had withdrawn, leaving behind a sense of watchful waiting that coloured later encounters with unexpected darkness. Host. These narratives evolved through retellings that blended the original reports of prolonged obscurity with elements drawn from older myths of a celestial withdrawal, fostering a quiet curiosity about whether the moon's absence had marked the beginning of longer cycles of hardship, or simply stood as an isolated wonder whose meaning lay in its endurance rather than its cause. Artistic representations, emerging first in the careful illuminations of later medieval manuscripts, offered another avenue for such memory to take shape where artists might depict the moon as a pale disk, half veiled by drifting vapours, or as a shadowed form suspended above landscapes that echoed the Italian valleys or English fens, their compositions inviting viewers to linger over the contrast between earthly solidity and heavenly uncertainty, out asserting any singular interpretation. Over subsequent generations, these images found echoes in broader visual traditions, perhaps in the subtle backgrounds of devotional panels or the marginal sketches of personal prayer books, where the darkened orb served as a contemplative motif rather than a dramatic spectacle, encouraging quiet meditation on the passage of time and the persistence of natural wonders across eras. Literary references followed a parallel path of transformation, beginning with occasional allusions in vernacular poetry that wove the eclipse into accounts of royal successions or seasonal misfortunes, then expanding in Renaissance chronicles and romantic ballads that reimagined the year E1110 as threshold moment, when ordinary folk first sensed the limits of their understanding. One could reflect on how these literary threads shifted across centuries, from early moralizing verses that treated the moon's withdrawal as a call to humility, through Enlightenment retellings that framed it within emerging narratives of natural philosophy, to 19th century novels and essays that cast the event as a symbol of forgotten anxieties surfacing in times of political change, each layer adding nuance without erasing the original sense of observed strangeness preserved in the Anglo-Saxon continuation and continental annals. The series' evolution thus mirrored the gradual unfolding of cultural memory itself. Details of atmospheric veils or unseasonable cold might recede in favour of more resonant images of communal vigilance, reckon our later writers to draw upon the eclipse as a touchstone for exploring themes of resilience amid uncertainty. In this way, collective memory preserved the trauma not through dramatic reenactment, but through understated continuities. Families and villages passed along fragments of the account, alongside recollections of harsh winters or disrupted harvests, embedding the lunar absence within a broader tapestry of endurance that honoured the chronicler's restraint, while inviting each new generation to consider how such moments of celestial withdrawal might still resonate in their own skies. Perhaps in remote hamlets, the tale surfaced during periods of social upheaval, subtly reminding listeners of earlier times when communities had navigated similar disquiet without resolution, or in scholarly circles it reappeared in essays that traced the eclipse's influence on later folklore motifs of hidden lights and veiled omens, always leaving space for the possibility that individual retellings adapted the core observation to local circumstances, rather than transmitting an unchanging narrative. Further contemplation arises when one considers how these strands of legend and literature intersected with the very landscapes that had witnessed the event, where a hillside in central Italy or a riverbank near Peterborough might carry faint associations in local memory, prompting walkers or storytellers to pause and imagine the same moon that once withdrew its light, now serving as a bridge between immediate fear and the slower work of remembrance. Over the centuries, the account thus changed in texture, sometimes softening into wistful anecdotes about ancestors who had watched the heavens in wonder, at other times sharpening into cautionary notes about the unpredictability of the natural world, yet always retaining an undercurrent of the original chronicler's emphasis on what was seen rather than what was concluded. Such preservation through collective memory allowed the eclipse to function as a quiet repository of shared vulnerability, where the trauma of unexpected darkness found expression not in grand monuments, but in the steady repetition of stories that connected distant observers to one another across time, fostering a sense of continuity that honoured both the event's strangeness and the human capacity to carry it forward without demanding closure. In this reflective space, the darkened moon of 1110 continued to invite gentle curiosity, passage into folklore and art and literature, standing as an extension of the same measured inquiry that had characterized its scientific rediscovery, where each retelling added a layer of meaning while preserving the core invitation to linger over the visible qualities of the night sky and the enduring rhythms of remembrance. One might imagine how these cultural threads, woven through oral traditions, manuscript margins, and evolving literary forms, ultimately enriched the broader tapestry of endurance, allowing the eclipse to echo, not as a resolved episode, but as an open possibility for ongoing reflection on how communities have long navigated the intersections of observed anomaly and transmitted memory. In the quiet unfolding of remembrance that had carried the darkened moon of 1110 from the measured lines of monastic annals into the softer folds of either-side tales and marginal sketches, one might sense an invitation to turn the gaze gently outward, toward other nights, when the heavens offered similar withdrawals of light, and when scattered communities across distant lands found themselves pausing beneath skies that seemed to hold their breath. Such moments, recurring at irregular intervals through the centuries, invite contemplation not as isolated spectacles, but as threads in a larger weave of human counter with celestial surprise, where the particular circumstances of atmospheric veils or dust-laden horizons could transform an ordinary lunar passage into something far more prolonged and unsettling, prompting reflections that echoed across generations, without ever settling into fixed explanations. One could imagine, for instance, standing on the outskirts of Constantinople in the year 536, chroniclers recorded a sun that appeared dimmed for many months, and a moon whose usual radiance gave way to a strange, coppery pallor that lingered through successive cycles, the air itself carrying a fine haze that filtered starlight into something muted and uncertain. Though separated by more than 5 centuries from the English and Italian accounts of 1110, this earlier episode shares a kinship. In the way observers noted the moon's reluctance to regain its brightness, perhaps linked to vast volcanic plumes that scattered ash across the northern hemisphere, and altered the delicate balance of light reaching the eye. The responses that followed, preserved in Byzantine histories, and echoed in later Syriac writings, spoke of unease that mingled practical concerns over harvests with quieter wonderings about whether such obscurations signalled shifts in the order of things, yet always leaving room for the possibility that local conditions or individual temperaments coloured how the darkness was received and remembered. Patterns emerge when one lingers over these recurrences, not as rigid repetitions, but as variations on a theme of attentive watching. communities in widely separated regions. From the river valleys of early medieval Europe to the high plateaus of Central Asia appear to have responded with a blend of immediate vigilance and longer-term storytelling that wove the anomaly into existing frameworks of seasonal expectation or ancestral caution. In the case of 536, the dimming extended across years rather than a single night, fostering chronicles that described birds falling and frosts arriving out of season, yet the human impulse remained one of measured recording rather than outright conclusion, allowing later interpreters to draw connections to periods of social strain without asserting direct causation. Similar threads surface in accounts from the 17th century, when observers in northern Europe noted unusually dark lunar eclipses coinciding with the aftermath of distant eruptions, the moon sometimes appearing so faint that it seemed to vanish entirely for stretches of time, prompting diary entries that blended meteorological observation with personal reflections on the fragility of accustomed rhythms. These historical moments, though distinct in their triggers and durations, draw connections through the shared quality of prolonged obscurity that invited people to reconsider their place amid larger atmospheric and celestial movements. One might reflect on how, in each instance, the absence of expected light became a prompt for quiet inquiry rather than frantic resolution, whether in the form of monastic marginalia noting the hue of the moon, or in oral traditions that preserved the sense of watchful waiting for descendants to ponder. The 536 event, in particular, stands apart for its multi-year span, during which the sun's weakness compounded the lunar dimming and contributed to what later climatologists have termed a brief cooling episode. Yet, even here the records emphasize observed phenomena over interpretive certainty, leaving space for the possibility that regional variations in dust distribution produced differing intensities of darkness from one valley to the next. Turning toward what distinguishes the 1110 eclipse within this lineage, one encounters a convergence of detailed contemporaneous descriptions. Descriptions that capture not only the moon's complete disappearance, but also the specific timing amid political transitions and reported climatic oddities. Elements that together lend the event a texture of immediacy preserved in the Anglo-Saxon continuation and parallel continental notices. Unlike the more diffuse haze of 536, the 1110 darkness appears to have been concentrated around a single eclipse cycle, chroniclers remarking on the moon's failure to recover its light, even after the expected duration, perhaps owing to a transient veil of particles that settled differently across the British Isles and Italian hillsides. This specificity invites comparison with later anomalies, such as those noted after the 1815 Tambora eruption, when European observers again recorded eclipses that seemed unusually faint. Yet, the 1110 accounts retain a unique restraint in their phrasing, focusing on what was seen rather than venturing broader claims about divine or natural causation. Across these varied episodes, recurring human response reveals itself as a gentle oscillation between practical adaptation and contemplative transmission, food, where initial surprise gave way to stories that carried the memory forward without demanding closure. In regions touched by the 536 dimming, for example, later generations might have recalled the altered skies when facing subsequent hardships, allowing the celestial event to serve as a quiet reference point within broader narratives of endurance rather than a singular omen. Parallel dynamics appear in indigenous accounts from the Americas, where certain oral traditions describe nights when the moon withdrew its face for extended periods, interpreted variously as moments of spiritual testing or seasonal markers, always shaped by the particular landscape and cultural context that surrounded the observation. Patterns underscore the adaptability of collective memory, which absorbs the strangeness of dark eclipses into existing forms of storytelling, preserving an undercurrent of the original visual impression. What sets 1110 apart amid these echoes lies perhaps in the density of European documentation that coincides with a period already marked by shifting alliances and reported weather irregularities, creating a historical node where the lunar absence could intersect with multiple layers of contemporary concern without being reduced to any single explanation. One could imagine how, in contrast to the extended twilight of 536, or the post-eruption pallor of later centuries, the 1110 event offered a sharper contrast between the expected brevity of an eclipse and the extended obscurity that followed, prompting scribes to note the phenomenon, with a prompting scribes to note historians that later allowed historians to trace possible atmospheric connections across the Channel and into the Mediterranean. This precision, in turn, facilitated the event's passage into folklore, not as an abstract warning, but as a tangible reference to a winter when moonlight itself seemed to pause, inviting subsequent generations to consider how such pauses might still arise under altered skies. Further connections arise when one considers how responses to these anomalies often bridged the gap between immediate sensory experience and the slower work of cultural preservation, whether through the careful inscriptions of monastic annals or the evolving oral recitations that adapted details to local needs. In the wake of 536, Byzantine writers recorded the sun's dimness alongside accounts of plague and scarcity. Yet the lunar observations remained embedded within a larger tapestry of natural and social observation, resisting any impulse to isolate the celestial from the terrestrial. Similarly, the 1110 eclipse found its way into chronicles that juxtaposed the moon's vanishing with notes on royal successions and harvest yields, creating a record that later readers could approach as a layered reminder of interconnected uncertainties rather than an isolated portent. Thus, across these instances the emphasis stays on the visible qualities of the night. The copper hue, the prolonged shadow, the unexpected stillness. Elements that continued to resonate in artistic and literary traditions long after the original witnesses had passed. One might linger over the possibility that each dark eclipse, while sharing atmospheric or observational traits, acquired uniqueness through the particular historical moment in which it occurred. Whether that moment involved the consolidation of new kingdoms, the aftermath of distant volcanic activity, or the quiet persistence of monastic record-keeping. The 1110 case, with its blend of detailed lunar description and contextual references to instability, thus stands as a distinctive point within the broader pattern, one that encouraged reflections on human smallness without foreclosing the potential for renewed curiosity in later eras. In this light, the echoes between 536 and 1110, and between both and subsequent anomalies, serve not to diminish any single event, but to highlight the enduring capacity of communities to carry forward fragments of observed strangeness, allowing each generation to add its own nuance, while honouring the restraint of the original chroniclers. Such contemplation extends naturally to the ways these events have invited ongoing inquiry into the interplay of dust, light, and perception, where modern understandings of volcanic winters or stratospheric particles offer possible frameworks without displacing the value of the historical impressions themselves. The uniqueness of 1110, then, rests in part on the survival of accounts that capture both the visual phenomenon and its embedding within a specific cultural landscape, fostering a legacy of measured remembrance that continues to prompt gentle reflection on how the night sky has long served as a canvas for shared vulnerability and quiet endurance across the centuries post. Yet, as one turns from these ancient echoes toward the inquiries of later centuries, a different kind of watching emerges, one that lingers not only over the recorded impressed darkened skies, but also over the faint traces preserved within the earth itself, where layers of ice and the growth rings of trees offer testimony that invites modern interpreters to consider how the lunar absence of 1110 might have arisen from atmospheric conditions far removed from the immediate view of any chronicler. One might imagine standing not on an Italian hillside, but before the careful extractions of polar ice, host, where each translucent stratum holds microscopic particles that settled from the upper air centuries ago, particles whose chemical signatures suggest the possibility of distant volcanic activity releasing sulfur compounds that could scatter moonlight and extend the duration of an eclipse shadow into something more lingering and copper-toned than expected. Such layers, drawn from Greenland or Antarctic cores, do not declare with certainty that a single eruption caused the precise night described in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. Yet they open a space for reflection on how a veil of aerosols, perhaps originating from eruptions in the years preceding 1110, might have intersected with the predictable geometry of lunar passage to produce the prolonged obscurity noted across multiple regions. Recent studies have turned again to these ice records, refining the dating of sulfate spikes and examining their correlation with historical accounts, dimmed eclipses, though always leaving room for the understanding that regional wind patterns and particle sizes could have distributed the effects unevenly, so that what appeared as total disappearance in one valley might have registered merely as unusual faintness elsewhere, tree ring sequences from across the northern hemisphere. Add another dimension to this contemplation, revealing narrow growth bands around the early 12th century that hint at cooler summers and altered precipitation conditions that might have coincided with the eclipse observations, without necessarily originating from the same source as the atmospheric dimming. These dendrochronological patterns, when placed alongside the medieval notices of strange weather, invite one to ponder the interplay between celestial events and terrestrial responses, where a temporary reduction in sunlight reaching the surface could have compounded existing climatic variability, yet without asserting that the 1110 darkness itself triggered any widespread cooling beyond the span of a few nights or weeks. In this light, the connection between the monastic records and contemporary climate science unfolds as a gentle dialogue rather than a conclusive mapping for chroniclers, captured the visual quality of the moon's reluctance to brighten, while the proxy data from ice and wood speak to the possible presence of stratospheric dust that might have lingered through successive lunar cycles. One could reflect on how such alignments, explored in recent papers that integrate historical texts with high-resolution ice core analyses, allow for the possibility that multiple small eruptions or a single larger event contributed to the conditions observed. Debates persist regarding the exact timing and magnitude, with some interpretations suggesting that the dust veil was thinner over the British Isles than over continental Europe, accounting for the varying intensities preserved in different annals. These discussions remain open, precisely because the evidence, while suggestive, carries the inherent uncertainties of proxy records. That cannot isolate a single night's phenomenon from the broader seasonal context. Further inquiry into modern understandings reveals how satellite observations of recent volcanic events, such as those following eruptions in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, provide analogies that help illuminate the mechanics of lunar dimming without claiming direct equivalence to the medieval case. Scattering of light by sulfate aerosols, for instance, can reduce the brightness of an eclipsed moon by filtering shorter wavelengths, producing the reddish or ash hues described in 1110. Yet the precise optical depth of any ancient veil remains a matter of estimation rather than measurement, prompting ongoing debates among researchers about whether local meteorological factors, such as increased cloud cover or humidity, might have amplified the effect in the ways the chronicles could not distinguish from atmospheric dust alone. Such considerations connect the sparse but vivid medieval accounts to the accumulating datasets of paleoclimatology, where the goal is not to confirm the chronicler's observations, but to explore how those observations might fit within larger patterns of volcanic influence on the atmosphere during the medieval climate anomaly, of whether the 1110 event represents an isolated atmospheric anomaly, or part of a cluster of similar episodes whose traces, smoothed by the passage of time in the ice cores. Some analyses proposing that additional undocumented eruptions could have contributed to the darkness without leaving distinct sulfate markers strong enough to survive in every core sample. Tree ring evidence from high-latitude sites continues to fuel these discussions, showing growth anomalies that align broadly with the period, yet vary in intensity from region to region, suggesting that any climatic response was modulated by local conditions, and perhaps by the timing of the eclipse relative to seasonal agricultural cycles noted in contemporary writings. This variability underscores the value of treating the historical and scientific records as complementary rather than hierarchical, each preserving fragments of a larger story whose full contours resist definitive reconstruction. One might linger over the ways in which these modern investigations preserve the same spirit of measured attention found in the original chronicles, where the emphasis rests on observed phenomena rather than sweeping conclusions, allowing space for the possibility that non-volcanic factors such as unusual stratospheric temperatures, or even solar variability, played a supporting role in extending the eclipse's darkness. Recent modelling efforts have begun to simulate the optical effects of hypothetical dust loadings, hyperdosed from the early 12th century, testing whether modest aerosol concentrations could indeed produce a moon that appeared to vanish entirely for observers in England and Italy, though the results remain sensitive to assumptions about particle distribution, and thus invite further refinement rather than closure. In connecting these simulations back to the medieval texts, researchers highlight how the chroniclers' focus on the moon's failure to recover its light aligns with the expected behaviour of light, scattering in a dust-laden atmosphere, yet without excluding the chance that perceptual factors, or the specific phase of the eclipse, contributed to the sense of prolonged absence. Crowd. Such explorations extend naturally into the realm of interdisciplinary work that places the 1110 accounts within the broader framework of how societies have recorded and interpreted atmospheric extremes, revealing that the same restraint evident in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle also characterises the cautious language of current scientific literature, where correlations are proposed and uncertainty is acknowledged in equal measure. Ice core studies continue to yield new data points as drilling techniques improve, occasionally surfacing evidence of volcanic events whose timing overlaps with clusters of dark eclipse reports, thereby enriching the dialogue between past observation and present analysis, without resolving every ambiguity surrounding the precise trigger of that particular night's strangeness. Tree rings, likewise, offer annual resolution that can be compared against the seasonal markers embedded in historical notices, such as references to winter conditions or harvest yields, fostering a layered understanding in which the lunar phenomenon sits alongside rather than apart from the climatic backdrop. Debates persist, for instance, over the attribution of certain narrow ring sequences to volcanic forcing versus other influences like ocean atmosphere oscillations, with some scholars arguing that the evidence for a significant eruption around 1108-1110 remains suggestive, but not conclusive, while others find stronger support when multiple proxy types are considered together. This ongoing conversation mirrors the way earlier generations transmitted the memory of the darkened moon without demanding singular explanations, allowing each era to add its own interpretive threads to the record. In this sense, the modern scientific lens does not replace the contemplative quality of the historical accounts, but extends it, inviting reflection on how particles invisible to the naked eye could shape the visible night sky in ways that resonated across both immediate experience and long-term environmental archives. One could consider the possibility that future analyses incorporating improved dating methods or additional core samples from underrepresented regions might clarify whether the atmospheric conditions of 1110 were truly exceptional, or merely one instance within a spectrum of variability that medieval observers happened to document with unusual detail. Until then, the records and the proxies together sustain a quiet invitation to ponder the interconnectedness of celestial mechanics, atmospheric chemistry, and human perception, where the vanishing moon of that distant year continues to serve as a point of convergence between the measured lines of annals and the accumulating layers of scientific inquiry. Through this convergence, the event retains its capacity to prompt gentle curiosity about the ways in which the night sky has long reflected not only predictable cycles, but also transient veils that momentarily alter the accustomed rhythms of light and shadow, leaving traces that later narration generations, Lochessens, may approach with the same measured attention once given by those who first noted the moon's reluctance to brighten. The interplay between these domains thus preserves an openness that echoes across the centuries, where each new finding from ice or wood adds a nuance without foreclosing the interpretive space that allows the original observations to remain vivid, unresolved in their deeper causes. Such reflections naturally lead toward considering how similar alignments between historical testimony and proxy evidence might illuminate other periods of atmospheric disturbance, yet always returning to the particular texture of 1110 as a moment where detailed description met conditions that modern tools can only approximate through indirect reconstruction. In this ongoing exchange, the scientific perspective offers not final answers, but an expanded canvas, upon which the medieval impressions of darkness can be contemplated anew, their mystery intact, even as their possible origins gain additional context from the slow accumulation of data drawn from the natural world itself. In the wake of those layered inquiries into ice and wood, where the 1110 observations meet their modern echoes without resolution, the vanishing moon leaves behind a quieter inheritance, one that stretches across the arc of later centuries, like faint fit after image of a light once extinguished. One might imagine returning to that Italian hillside, or to the cloistered scriptorium, where the Anglo-Saxon annalist once set down his measured words, only to find that the event did not conclude with the dawn that followed, but instead settled into the fabric of how succeeding generations regarded the heavens themselves, not as immutable certainties, but as realms open to patient questioning and occasional surprise. The lasting impact unfolds not in any single documented shift, but in the subtle recalibration of attention. Chroniclers and scholars, after 1110, began to record lunar passages with greater regularity, noting not merely the fact of an eclipse, but its duration, colour, and unexpected prolongations, though the strange absence had planted a seed of vigilance that would grow into more systematic astronomical notations in the decades and centuries ahead. This evolution in approach appears most clearly in the way monastic communities across Europe began to integrate celestial records into their broader annals, treating the sky as a text worthy of repeated reading rather than isolated marvels. Post. One could reflect on how the 1110 account, with its emphasis on the moon's reluctance to recover its light, may have encouraged later writers to preserve similar descriptions, even when the phenomena proved less dramatic, fostering a continuity of observation that bridged the medieval period toward the more formalized studies of the 13th and 14th centuries. Yet, without claiming any direct causation, it remains possible to see in these accumulating notices a gradual turn toward viewing astronomy as an endeavour intertwined with terrestrial life, where an eclipse's peculiarities invited consideration of atmospheric conditions, alongside geometric predictions, opening interpretive spaces, a vastissimo that later natural philosophers would explore with increasing precision. What the episode reveals about human psychology emerges through the enduring tension between wonder and unease that such skyward events have long provoked, a response that the 1110 darkness seems to have crystallized in its particular intensity. Observers confronted with a moon that lingered in shadow beyond unshadow. Beyond expectation might have felt not only fear, but also a profound sense of smallness for forces that transcended daily rhythms, prompting reflections on mortality, divine order, and the fragility of accustomed patterns. This psychological resonance does not demand singular interpretations, yet invites contemplation of how collective memory transforms transient phenomena into enduring touchstones, where the story of a vanished moon could surface in later folklore or devotional writings as a reminder of moments when the boundary between the predictable and the mysterious grew thin. Across broader historical patterns, similar alignments recur. Whenever societies have turned their gaze upward during times of transition, whether in the wake of political upheavals or amid shifting climatic conditions, suggesting that the 1110 event participates in a longer sequence of celestial encounters that have repeatedly prompted humans to renegotiate their place within a larger cosmos. One might trace these patterns through the ways in which the eclipse's memory intersected with evolving understandings, natural philosophy, where the possibility of atmospheric veils or unexpected optical effects began to coexist alongside traditional astrological frameworks without immediate displacement. In this light, the legacy appears as an invitation to hold multiple explanations in suspension, much as the original chroniclers recorded the darkness without insisting on its ultimate cause. The relationship between sky and earth, so vividly illustrated by the 1110 accounts and their later scientific resonances, thus extends into a meditation on interdependence. Changes in the upper atmosphere could alter the perceived brightness of a lunar eclipse, while simultaneously echoing through agricultural cycles, weather lore, and the quiet anxieties preserved in annals. This interconnection does not assert dominance of one domain over the other, but rather sustains a gentle reciprocity, in which terrestrial conditions shape the visibility of celestial events, just as those events colour human perceptions of the world below. Further along this reflective path, the 1110 eclipse surfaces in later historical consciousness through indirect channels, such as the preservation of eclipse tables in university manuscripts, or the incorporation of anomalous lunar descriptions into works on optics and meteorology that would influence Renaissance thinkers. One could imagine how the story of a moon that failed to brighten might have travelled alongside accounts of other darkened skies, of Lunt contributing to a cumulative awareness that eclipses sometimes deviate from geometric expectations in ways that reward sustained inquiry rather than hasty conclusions. Host. Such threads connect the event to wider patterns of intellectual history. Moments of observational surprise have occasionally accelerated the refinement of instruments or the compilation of comparative records, though always leaving room for the recognition that cultural contexts shape which phenomena receive emphasis and which fade into the background psychologically. The episode underscores the human tendency to seek coherence amid uncertainty, transforming an extended lunar shadow into narratives of warning or revelation that could resonate through generations. Yet these interpretations remain fluid, allowing each era to project its own concerns onto the same sparse medieval notices without exhausting their suggestive power. In connecting the 1110 darkness to broader historical rhythms, one notices parallels with other periods when atmospheric or celestial anomalies coincided with social flux, earlier medieval reports of dimmed suns, to later instances of prolonged twilight that prompted both scientific speculation and popular unease. These alignments highlight how the sky has served as a mirror for earthly conditions, reflecting not only light but also the interpretive frameworks through which communities process disruption. The legacy thus preserves an openness that echoes the measured tone of the original chronicles, where the emphasis rests on what was seen rather than what must be concluded. One might linger over the possibility that the event subtly encouraged a more integrated view of astronomy, one that acknowledged the interplay of predictable cycles and transient atmospheric influences, thereby laying groundwork for later inquiries that would treat the heavens and the air as parts of a single variable system. This perspective does not claim revolutionary change, but rather a gradual enrichment of attention, visible in the increasing detail of subsequent eclipse descriptions that sometimes reference sometimes colour, duration, accompanying weather, in ways reminiscent of the 1110 account, reflecting on the relationship between sky and earth, brings forward the enduring image of observers standing beneath a coppered or absent moon, their gaze drawn upward, while their feet remained feet-planted in fields or cloisters, where daily life continued amid whatever uncertainties the darkness evoked. Such moments remind us that celestial events have long offered occasions for contemplating interdependence, where a veil of distant particles or an unusual alignment of bodies could alter both the night sky and the stories told beneath it. In this sense, the vanishing moon of 1110 continues to function as a point of convergence. Memory, its memory sustained through scientific reconstructions, historical rereadings, quiet recognition that human responses to the heavens reveal as much about perception and psychology as about the phenomena themselves. As centuries unfolded, this convergence found expression in diverse forms, from the cautious annotations of later analysts who cross-referenced lunar events with terrestrial omens, to the more analytical frameworks of early modern astronomers who revisited medieval records in search of patterns. One could consider how the 1110 description, preserved in its stark simplicity, might have prompted later scholars to question assumptions about atmospheric clarity, or to explore the optical properties that could render an eclipse unusually prolonged, thereby contributing to a lineage of inquiry that values both observation and the acknowledgement of unresolved variables. These developments unfold without certainty of direct lineage, yet invite reflection on the cumulative effect of such recorded surprises in shaping attitudes toward the natural world. The broader historical patterns reveal themselves in the recurring motif of eclipses serving as catalysts for cultural reflection, whether in times of dynastic change or amid environmental stresses that made darkened skies feel especially portentous. The 1110 event fits within this sequence not as a unique rupture, but as one instance where detailed testimony met conditions that amplified its resonance, encouraging subsequent generations to approach similar phenomena with a blend of reverence and curiosity. Human psychology, in turn, emerges here as a capacity for layering meaning onto transient darkness, transforming an extended shadow into a prompt for contemplating order, disorder, and the spaces between. Ultimately, the legacy of the vanishing moon resides in this sustained invitation to observe with care, to record without closure, and to recognize the sky's capacity to illuminate the intricate bonds that tie celestial mechanics to earthly experience. One might return, in closing this contemplation, to the hillside or the archive, where the memory of that night continues to unfold as a gentle prompt for wondering how future alignments of record and reconstruction might yet add new dimensions to an event whose deeper contours remain open to ongoing measured attention. Somewhere in central Italy, if you could stand on a hillside on a quiet night and look out over the dark valleys below, you might feel like you're seeing something older than history, older than the Forum, older than the legions, older than the name Rome itself. The olive trees whisper in the breeze as they have for centuries, and above them the sky holds its ancient vigil, now free of the coppered shadows that once lingered over the moon in 1110, yet still carrying the faint resonance of that prolonged darkness. One might linger here not to resolve what happened, but to allow the memory of the vanishing moon to settle once more, drawing together the threads of scientific reconstruction and human response into a single, unbroken contemplation that stretches forward from that medieval night into the quiet present. The eclipse of 1110, recorded with such measured astonishment in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, and echoed in scattered European annals, offers no final certainty about its causes, whether atmospheric veils from distant eruptions or subtler optical effects that stretched the usual geometry of lunar passage beyond expectation. Yet, in holding these possibilities side by side with the immediate reactions of fear, prayer, interpretive, searching, that swept through communities already navigating political fractures and climatic unease, the event reveals how a single celestial anomaly could mirror and magnify the uncertainties of earthly life. Scientific inquiry today traces potential links to volcanic dust or temperature shifts without claiming definitive proof, while historical accounts preserve the human dimension of observers who watched the moon refuse to brighten and felt the boundaries of their familiar world grow thin. This interplay does not demand resolution, but invites a gentle recognition that the cosmos operates according to rhythms that sometimes intersect unpredictably with the conditions of the air we breathe and the stories we tell beneath it. One could imagine the chroniclers returning to their scriptoria after that night, quills poised over parchment as they weighed whether to frame the darkness as omen or observation, words carrying forward a tension between reverence for divine order and an emerging attentiveness to the particulars of colour, duration, delay. Across later centuries, this attentiveness may have contributed, in ways that remain suggestive rather than certain, to the gradual accumulation of eclipse records that treated the sky as a variable text rather than a fixed backdrop. The human element persists alongside these notations, for the unease that accompanied the 1110 darkness speaks to a deeper psychological pattern in which celestial surprises prompt reflections on fragility, mortality, and the search for meaning amid forces that exceed daily comprehension. Whether those reflections took shape as religious warnings or quiet philosophical wonder, they underscore how communities have long used moments of skyward disruption to renegotiate their place within a larger order, without ever exhausting the mystery that first drew their gaze upward. In this light, the legacy of the vanishing moon extends beyond any single documented shift in astronomical practice, and into a broader meditation on interdependence, hosts, where changes in the upper atmosphere could alter the perceived brightness of an eclipse, while simultaneously colouring agricultural lore, devotional writings, and the quiet anxieties preserved in annals. Possibilities abound without insistence. Perhaps the event subtly encouraged later natural philosophers to hold atmospheric influences and geometric predictions in suspension, allowing both to inform interpretations of similar phenomena in the centuries that followed. Or perhaps its memory travelled indirectly through university manuscript and optical treatises, contributing to a cumulative awareness that eclipses sometimes deviate from expectation in ways that reward sustained attention rather than hasty conclusions. Either way, the record remains open, inviting each generation to project its own questions onto the sparse medieval notices, while recognizing that cultural contexts shape which details receive emphasis and which fade into the background of collective memory, returning to the hillside or the archive. One senses how the 1110 darkness continues to function as a point of convergence between the measurable and the ineffable. Modern reconstructions of possible volcanic influences or temperature anomalies add new dimensions to the chronicle accounts without displacing the original sense of strangeness, much as contemporary understandings of lunar mechanics coexist with the enduring human response of awe when the familiar night sky alters its course. This coexistence fosters a sense of wonder about the cosmos that feels especially fitting for flexion, for the moon that vanished and lingered beyond expectation reminds us that even predictable cycles can yield surprises when transient conditions intervene. The universe reveals itself not as a clockwork mechanism alone, but as a dynamic interplay of bodies, particles, and perceptions, where an alignment of sun, earth, and moon can illuminate both the geometry of orbits and the interpretive frameworks through which observers process disruption. Such wonder does not require dramatic claims, but unfolds through quiet consideration of how the event participated in longer historical rhythms, from earlier reports of dimmed skies to later instances when atmospheric anomalies coincided with social transitions. The 1110 account, with its emphasis on the moon's reluctance to recover its light, stands as one instance among many where celestial encounters prompted societies to reconsider the relationship between heaven and earth, between predictable patterns and the spaces where mystery persists. Human psychology enters here as a capacity for layering meaning on to transient darkness, transforming an extended shadow into narratives that could resonate through generations without ever claiming exhaustive truth. These interpretations remain fluid, allowing the same sparse notices to speak differently to monastic communities, Renaissance scholars, present-day listeners, attuned to both scientific possibility and the psychological resonance of a sky that withholds its usual brightness. One might trace these patterns further by imagining how the story of a moon that failed to brighten could have travelled alongside accounts of other darkened skies, contributing to an evolving awareness that observational surprise sometimes accelerates the refinement of records or instruments, while leaving room for the acknowledgement of unresolved variables. This lineage values both the precision of later Eclipse tales and the measured tone of the original chronicles, where the emphasis rests on what was seen rather than what must be concluded, connecting the 1110 event to such broader arcs. The reflection underscores an openness that echoes across intellectual history, where moments of celestial uncertainty have occasionally enriched the view of astronomy intertwined as with terrestrial conditions, from weather lore to the quiet anxieties that accompany political or environmental flux. Psychological dimension deepens when one considers how observers standing beneath that coppered or absent moon might have felt not only fear but also a profound smallness before forces that transcended accustomed rhythms, prompting contemplations of order, disorder, and the intricate bonds that tie celestial mechanics to earthly experience. This sense of smallness does not diminish human curiosity, but rather sustains it, encouraging the patient questioning that later centuries would bring to similar phenomena. Across diverse cultural contexts, the same tension recurs, whether in times of dynastic change or amid environmental stresses that made unusual skies feel especially portentous, suggesting that the 1110 darkness participates in a sequence of encounters that repeatedly invite communities to renegotiate their relationship with the cosmos without ever reaching final certainty. As the narrative draws toward its close, Vanishing Moon of 1110 leaves behind an invitation to observe with care, to record without closure, and to recognize that the sky's capacity to illuminate interdependence extends into the present moment of listening. Scientific elements and human responses converge, here in a single contemplative space, where reconstructions of atmospheric effects meet the enduring wonder provoked by a night when the moon lingered in shadow. Faust. This convergence does not assert dominance of one domain over the other, but sustains a gentle reciprocity in which terrestrial conditions shape the visibility of celestial events, just as those events colour perceptions of the world below. One might return again to the Italian hillside, where the olive trees continue their ancient whisper and the valleys hold their darkness, now under a sky whose familiar brightness carries the faint afterimage of that medieval surprise, reminding us that the cosmos remains a realm open to ongoing measured attention. If these reflections on the year without a moon have offered a sense of calm, wonder, and historical curiosity, support helps the channel can continue creating such explorations for listeners seeking full journeys through the past. So kindly consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing for more histories that soothe the mind. We would also love to hear where you are listening from, so please share your location in the comments below. Your engagement makes these quiet narratives possible. And we thank you for joining us on this contemplative path through the strange eclipse of 1110 and its lingering echoes.